The winter winds that swept across the Thames Valley on December the 6th, 1421, carried with them the cries of a newborn who would inherit one of the most precarious thrones in English history. Within the stone walls of Windsor Castle, Queen Catherine of Valois gave birth to a son who entered the world as heir to two kingdoms locked in perpetual warfare. The infant Henry VI arrived during the height of his father's military campaigns in France, where Henry V was consolidating English control over vast swathes of Norman and Burgundian territory. The timing of the birth seemed auspicious. The Lancastrian dynasty had produced another male heir to continue the dual monarchy that Henry V had fought so determinedly to establish. The child's earliest months unfolded against the backdrop of his father's continued absence in France. Henry V remained committed to his military objectives, pressing forward with siege operations and diplomatic negotiations that would secure English dominance over the French crown. The king's letters from this period reveal his satisfaction at having secured the succession, yet also his unwavering focus on the immediate military situation. The infant prince was placed under the care of experienced court attendants at Windsor, while his mother, Queen Catherine, maintained the ceremonial duties expected of her position. The royal household operated with the confident assumption that Henry V would return victorious to guide his son's upbringing and eventual preparation for kingship. This carefully ordered world shattered on August 31st, 1422, when news reached England that Henry V had died at the Château de Vincennes near Paris. The king had succumbed to what contemporary accounts describe as a severe flux, likely dysentery, at the age of 35. The death occurred just 2 months before the death of the mad French king Charles VI, creating an unprecedented constitutional situation. The 9-month-old Henry VI found himself simultaneously King of England and, according to the Treaty of Troyes, King of France. No English monarch had ever inherited such extensive territories at such a tender age, and the practical implications of governing two kingdoms through a regency stretched the administrative capabilities of the medieval state to their limits. The immediate aftermath of Henry V's death revealed the fundamental weakness of personal monarchy when confronted with minority rule. The late king's will had made provisions for the regency, but the document's interpretation quickly became a source of contention among the nobility. Henry IV had designated his brother Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, as protector of England, while John, Duke of Bedford, the eldest surviving brother, was to govern the English territories in France. This division reflected Henry's understanding that the two kingdoms required different approaches. England needed domestic stability and administrative continuity, while France demanded military leadership and constant vigilance against resurgent French forces under the Dauphin Charles. The Regency Council that emerged from these arrangements represented a delicate balance of competing interests and personalities. Humphrey of Gloucester, then 32 years old, possessed the ambition and energy that had characterized the Lancastrian brothers, but lacked the diplomatic subtlety and military genius of Henry V. His appointment as protector granted him significant authority over domestic affairs, including control over the young king's person and household. However, the council's structure deliberately limited his power, requiring consultation with other members on major decisions. This constraint reflected the nobility's wariness of concentrating too much authority in any single individual during a prolonged minority. Cardinal Henry Beaufort, the king's great-uncle and one of the wealthiest men in England, emerged as Gloucester's primary rival within the regency framework. Beaufort's position as Bishop of Winchester and later Cardinal provided him with both spiritual authority and enormous financial resources derived from his ecclesiastical holdings. His political philosophy differed markedly from Gloucester's more aggressive approach to both domestic and foreign policy. Where Gloucester favoured direct action and military solutions, Beaufort advocated for diplomatic negotiation and financial prudence. This fundamental disagreement over strategy would define much of the Regency period and create persistent instability within the government. The Duke of Bedford's role in France proved equally challenging but more immediately successful. Bedford possessed genuine military talent and had served effectively under his brother during the later stages of the French campaigns. His position as regent of France required him to maintain English control over territories that remained contested and expensive to defend. The French forces under the Dauphin Charles had not accepted the legitimacy of English rule, and Bedford faced the constant threat of military action, combined with the diplomatic challenge of maintaining the Burgundian alliance that had proven crucial to English success. The practical mechanics of governing through a regency council created numerous administrative complications. Decisions that Henry V could have made instantly now required consultation, debate, and formal approval from multiple parties. The Great Seal, essential for validating royal documents, had to be carefully controlled to prevent unauthorized use. Financial matters became particularly complex, as the regency needed to fund both domestic administration and the ongoing military commitments in France, while managing the royal debt that had accumulated during Henry V's campaigns. The young king himself remained largely insulated from these political machinations during his earliest years. Contemporary accounts describe a child who displayed remarkable gentleness and piety from an early age. Unlike his father, who had shown clear signs of the martial temperament that would define his reign, Henry VI exhibited a preference for quiet contemplation and religious observance. His tutors reported that he showed greater interest in prayer and scholarly pursuits than in the military exercises typically emphasized in royal education. This temperamental difference became more pronounced as the child grew older, creating concern among those who expected him to eventually assume the aggressive leadership role that his father had embodied. The contrast between father and son extended beyond mere personality traits to encompass fundamentally different approaches to kingship itself. Henry V had viewed monarchy as an active, interventionist institution requiring constant personal involvement in military, diplomatic, and administrative affairs. The young Henry VI, even in childhood, seemed drawn to a more contemplative model of rulership that emphasized moral authority over physical force. His religious devotion manifested in extended periods of prayer and a genuine interest in theological questions that impressed his clerical tutors but worried the secular nobility who anticipated eventual resumption of the French wars. The Regency's handling of the king's education reflected these concerns while attempting to accommodate his natural inclinations. The curriculum established for Henry VI included the traditional elements of royal instruction, languages, rhetoric, mathematics, and military theory, but also incorporated extensive religious instruction that went beyond the conventional requirements for a medieval monarch. His tutors included both secular scholars and prominent churchmen, creating an educational environment that reinforced his natural tendency toward piety, while attempting to provide the practical knowledge necessary for effective rulership. The financial pressures facing the Regency became increasingly acute as the 1420s progressed. The English territories in France required substantial military expenditure to maintain security, while domestic administration continued to demand regular funding. The Regency lacked Henry's personal authority to demand extraordinary taxation, and Parliament proved reluctant to grant the extensive subsidies that the situation required. Cardinal Beaufort's personal wealth became crucial to the government's financial stability, as he repeatedly provided loans to cover immediate expenses. This financial dependence gave Beaufort additional leverage in his ongoing disputes with Gloucester over policy direction. The rivalry between Gloucester and Beaufort intensified throughout the 1420s, creating a persistent source of governmental instability. Their disagreements encompassed both personal animosity and genuine policy differences. Gloucester favoured an aggressive continuation of the French wars, arguing that military success would ultimately provide the resources necessary to resolve the Regency's financial difficulties. Beaufort advocated for a more defensive posture that would reduce immediate military expenses while seeking diplomatic solutions to the French conflict. These competing visions reflected different understandings of England's strategic position and available resources. The Duke of Bedford's successes in France during the early 1420s initially supported Gloucester's more aggressive approach. Bedford's victory at Verneuil in 1424 demonstrated that English forces could still achieve decisive military results against French opposition. The battle itself showcased the continued effectiveness of English longbow tactics when properly employed, as Bedford's forces decisively defeated a combined French and Scottish army. The victory temporarily stabilised the English position in northern France and provided the Regency with both military prestige and captured resources that helped address immediate financial pressures. However, Bedford's military successes could not resolve the underlying strategic challenges facing English rule in France. The territories under English control remained vulnerable to French raids and required constant military presence to maintain security. The cost of maintaining garrisons, paying soldiers, and supporting the administrative apparatus of occupation continued to strain the Regency's resources. Bedford's requests for additional men and money from England created ongoing tension with the domestic priorities that Gloucester and the Council needed to address. The young king's development during these years remained largely separate from the immediate political struggles surrounding the Regency. Court records from the period describe a child who showed remarkable composure and dignity despite his youth. Foreign ambassadors who met Henry VI during formal ceremonies consistently commented on his serious demeanour and apparent intelligence. However, these same observers noted his lack of interest in the military displays and martial exercises that typically captivated young nobles. The king's preference for religious ceremonies and scholarly discussions became increasingly apparent as he approached adolescence. The Regency's efforts to manage both domestic and foreign challenges while preparing the young king for eventual personal rule created a complex web of competing priorities and interests. The system established after Henry V's death had provided initial stability, but the inherent tensions between the major figures involved, particularly Gloucester and Beaufort, threatened to undermine the government's effectiveness. The Duke of Bedford's continued presence in France meant that the most militarily capable member of the royal family remained absent from domestic politics, leaving the field to personalities less suited to the diplomatic compromise that the situation required. As the 1430s approached, the Regency faced mounting challenges on multiple fronts. The financial situation continued to deteriorate despite Beaufort's loans and Parliament's occasional grants. The French military situation, while not immediately critical, showed signs of increasing French coordination and effectiveness. Most significantly, the young king's personality was developing in ways that suggested he would not naturally assume the aggressive leadership role that his inheritance seemed to require. These converging pressures would soon test the Regency system's ability to maintain stability while preparing for an eventual transition to personal rule by a monarch whose temperament differed fundamentally from the warrior king tradition that had brought the Lancastrian dynasty to power. The constitutional crisis that emerged from Henry VI's unprecedented dual inheritance required immediate resolution through formal coronation ceremonies that would establish his legitimacy in both kingdoms. The Regency Council, despite its internal divisions, recognised that symbolic displays of royal authority could compensate for the practical limitations imposed by the king's minority. The decision to proceed with Henry's coronation as King of England took precedence over French ceremonial requirements, both for practical reasons and to reinforce English control over the domestic political situation. Westminster Abbey, the traditional site of English coronations since William the Conqueror, provided the historical continuity that the Regency desperately needed to project. The coronation ceremony held on November 6, 1429, represented a carefully orchestrated display of Lancastrian legitimacy and royal continuity. The 7-year-old Henry VI, dressed in cloth of gold and ermine robes that had been specially tailored to accommodate his small frame, processed through London streets lined with cheering crowds who had been encouraged to attend through proclamations emphasising the historic nature of the occasion. The young king's demeanour during the lengthy ceremony impressed contemporary observers, who noted his ability to maintain composure throughout the complex ritual requirements despite his youth. Cardinal Beaufort, as the senior English prelate, performed the coronation service, placing the crown of St Edward upon the child's head while the assembled nobility knelt in homage. The symbolic elements of the coronation carried particular significance given the circumstances of Henry's inheritance. The regalia used in the ceremony included items specifically associated with both English and French royal traditions, creating visual connections to the dual monarchy that Henry V had established through conquest and treaty. The crown itself, while traditionally English, had been modified to incorporate elements that referenced the French royal tradition, including fleur-de-lis decorations that served as constant reminders of Henry's claim to the French throne. The ceremony concluded with the traditional acclamation by the assembled lords, whose voices echoed through the abbey's stone vaults as they proclaimed their loyalty to their newly crowned sovereign. The coronation's immediate aftermath revealed both the strengths and limitations of ceremonial monarchy during a regency period. While the formal recognition of Henry's royal status provided legal clarity for governmental decisions, the practical authority remained distributed among the Regency Council members. The Duke of Gloucester's position as protector gained additional legitimacy from his role as the crowned king's primary guardian, but Cardinal Beaufort's influence over policy decisions continued through his control of governmental finances. The ceremony had successfully established Henry's symbolic authority, while leaving the underlying power structure unchanged, creating a situation where royal legitimacy existed alongside practical limitations on monarchical power. The French inheritance presented far more complex challenges that extended beyond ceremonial recognition to encompass active military and diplomatic requirements. The English position in France had begun deteriorating even before Henry V's death, but the Regency period witnessed an acceleration of territorial losses that threatened the entire foundation of the dual monarchy. The Treaty of Troyes, which had provided the legal basis for English claims to the French crown, assumed continuous military success and Burgundian cooperation. Both assumptions proved increasingly problematic as French resistance organised around the Dauphin Charles, who rejected English legitimacy and maintained alternative governmental structures in territories beyond English control. The Duke of Bedford's military leadership in France demonstrated considerable tactical skill, but could not overcome the strategic disadvantages facing English forces. The territories under English control formed an irregular patchwork rather than a coherent defensive unit, requiring garrisoned forces at numerous scattered locations. Each fortified position demanded regular supply deliveries, troop rotations and maintenance expenses that strained the Regency's financial resources. Bedford's correspondence with the English council during this period reveals his growing frustration with inadequate funding and reinforcement, as he struggled to maintain military effectiveness while operating with increasingly limited resources. The emergence of Joan of Arc in 1429 fundamentally altered the military and psychological dynamics of the French conflict in ways that the English command structure initially failed to comprehend. The 17-year-old peasant girl's arrival at the court of the Dauphin Charles represented more than simply another military development. Her claims of divine inspiration and her successful identification of the disguised Dauphin created a powerful narrative that challenged the legitimacy of English rule in France. Her insistence that Charles represented the true royal line blessed by God directly contradicted the English position that Henry VI held legitimate sovereignty over both kingdoms through his grandfather's inheritance and his father's conquests. Joan's military impact became immediately apparent during the Siege of Orleans, where English forces had maintained a stranglehold on the strategic Loire River crossing since October 1428. The siege represented a crucial test of English military capabilities, as success would have opened southern France to further English expansion, while demonstrating continued military superiority over French resistance. The English siege works, constructed according to established military engineering principles, included fortified positions that controlled access routes to the city while maintaining supply lines to English-held territories. The siege commanders, including the Earl of Suffolk and Lord Talbot, possessed extensive experience in siege warfare and had successfully conducted similar operations throughout the French campaigns. The transformation of the military situation following Joan's arrival at Orléans demonstrated the psychological dimensions of medieval warfare that extended beyond purely tactical considerations. French forces that had previously shown reluctance to engage English troops directly suddenly displayed aggressive confidence in their attacks on English positions. The siege works that had effectively contained Orléans for months came under sustained assault from French forces operating with unprecedented coordination and determination. English accounts of the fighting describe French attacks characterized by unusual persistence and apparent disregard for casualties, suggesting that Joan's presence had indeed altered the fundamental morale dynamics of the conflict. The lifting of the siege on May 8, 1429, marked the beginning of a series of French military successes that reversed years of English territorial gains. The rapid French advance following the Orléans victory demonstrated the fragility of English control over territories that had appeared securely held. Towns and fortifications that had accepted English rule without significant resistance suddenly declared for the Dauphin Charles, creating a cascade effect that undermined English positions throughout the Loire Valley. The speed of these reversals caught English commanders unprepared, as their defensive strategies had assumed continued French disorganisation and limited coordination between different resistance groups. The financial implications of these military setbacks extended far beyond the immediate costs of replacing lost equipment and evacuating garrison forces. The Regency had based its financial planning on the assumption that French territories would generate revenue through taxation and tribute that would help offset the costs of military occupation. The loss of productive agricultural regions and commercial centres eliminated these expected income sources, while simultaneously increasing the expenses required to defend remaining English positions. The Duke of Bedford's urgent requests for additional funding from England arrived at Westminster just as the Regency Council was grappling with mounting domestic expenses and parliamentary resistance to new taxation. Cardinal Beaufort's financial resources became increasingly crucial to maintaining English military operations in France, but his willingness to provide loans carried political conditions that affected policy decisions. Beaufort's preference for diplomatic solutions over continued military escalation aligned with his assessment that English resources were insufficient to sustain prolonged warfare against resurgent French forces. His loans to the Regency came with implicit expectations that the government would pursue negotiated settlements rather than expensive military campaigns. This financial leverage allowed Beaufort to influence strategic decisions despite the Duke of Gloucester's formal authority over policy implementation. The psychological impact of Joan of Arc's successes extended beyond immediate military considerations to challenge fundamental assumptions about English legitimacy in France. Her claim of divine mission to expel English forces and crown the Dauphin at Reims Cathedral directly contradicted English assertions that Henry VI represented God's chosen ruler of both kingdoms. The religious dimensions of this challenge proved particularly problematic for English propaganda efforts, as Joan's apparent miracles and prophetic accuracy created compelling evidence for her divine inspiration. English attempts to dismiss her as a witch or fraud lost credibility as French military successes continued to mount under her influence. The coronation of the Dauphin Charles as King Charles VII at Reims Cathedral on July 17, 1429, with Joan of Arc standing beside him, represented a direct challenge to Henry VI's claim to the French throne that could not be ignored through diplomatic channels. The ceremony took place in the traditional coronation site of French kings, using the sacred oil of Clovis that provided religious legitimacy to French royal authority. The symbolism of the event resonated throughout France and beyond, as it demonstrated that French resistance had achieved sufficient military success to control the kingdom's most sacred ceremonial site. The coronation effectively created two competing claims to French royal authority, with Charles VII now possessing the religious legitimacy that came from traditional coronation rites. The English response to Charles VII's coronation required careful consideration of both military and diplomatic options. The Regency Council faced pressure to organise a comparable ceremony that would establish Henry VI's French royal status through appropriate religious ritual. However, the practical requirements for such a ceremony included military control over Reims Cathedral or another suitably prestigious location, along with the cooperation of French ecclesiastical authorities who increasingly supported Charles VII. The logistical challenges of organising a coronation in hostile territory while maintaining adequate security for the young king created additional complications for English strategic planning. The deteriorating military situation in France forced the Regency to confront fundamental questions about the sustainability of the dual monarchy that Henry V had established. The financial costs of maintaining English positions continued to escalate while the territorial base that justified these expenses steadily contracted. Parliamentary grants for French military operations faced increasing resistance from English taxpayers who questioned the wisdom of continued investment in apparently unsuccessful campaigns. The Regency found itself caught between the political necessity of maintaining Henry VI's French inheritance and the practical impossibility of doing so with available resources. The Duke of Bedford's strategic assessments during this period revealed his growing pessimism about English prospects in France without substantial reinforcement and financial support that the Regency could not provide. His military dispatches described French forces operating with improved organisation and equipment that suggested external support, possibly from Scotland or other English enemies. The coordination between different French resistance groups had reached levels that threatened English control over territories that had remained stable for years. Bedford's recommendations increasingly emphasised defensive consolidation rather than offensive operations, representing a fundamental shift from the aggressive expansion that had characterised English strategy under Henry V. The impact of these developments on the young Henry VI remained largely indirect, as the Regency Council continued to shield him from immediate political pressures while managing the crisis. However, the king's education necessarily reflected the changing circumstances of his inheritance. His tutors began emphasising diplomatic and administrative skills over military training, recognising that his reign would likely require different capabilities than those that had served his father. The contrast between Henry V's warrior king model and the emerging requirements for Henry VI's reign became increasingly apparent as the French situation deteriorated and domestic challenges mounted. The transition from regency to personal rule occurred with none of the dramatic ceremony that had marked Henry VI's coronations, but rather through a gradual assumption of royal prerogatives that reflected both the king's temperament and the political realities facing England in 1437. At 16, Henry possessed the legal right to govern independently, yet the practical mechanisms of medieval administration required careful negotiation between the young monarch and the established power structures that had managed the kingdom during his minority. The Duke of Gloucester's formal relinquishment of his protectorate authority proceeded smoothly, though his continued presence at court ensured that the transition would not eliminate existing factional tensions within the royal council. Henry's first independent acts as monarch revealed the profound differences between his approach to kingship and the aggressive model established by his father. Where Henry V had immediately focused on military preparations and territorial expansion, The young Henry VI demonstrated an instinctive preference for diplomatic solutions over armed conflict. His early council meetings, recorded in the Chancery rolls, show a consistent pattern of the king questioning military expenditures while expressing interest in peace negotiations that his advisers often viewed with scepticism. This inclination toward pacifism emerged not from weakness or indecision, but from a genuine philosophical conviction that warfare represented a failure of Christian governance rather than a necessary tool of statecraft. The king's religious devotion, which had impressed observers throughout his childhood, intensified during his early years of personal rule in ways that fundamentally shaped his political priorities. Henry's daily routine included extended periods of private prayer that often delayed council meetings and administrative business, creating frustration among courtiers accustomed to the efficient dispatch of governmental affairs. His personal confessor, John Blackman, later recorded that the king would spend hours in contemplation before making decisions, seeking divine guidance through prayer and scriptural study. This methodical approach to decision-making, while admirable in its moral seriousness, proved inadequate to address the urgent military and financial crises that demanded immediate royal attention. The founding of Eton College in 1440 represented Henry's most significant early achievement and demonstrated his commitment to educational advancement that would define much of his reign. The King's Charter for the college, written in his own hand, established an institution dedicated to providing free education for 70 poor scholars who would subsequently proceed to King's College, Cambridge, which Henry founded simultaneously as a complementary institution. The architectural plans for Eton, personally approved by Henry, called for a magnificent chapel that would rival the greatest ecclesiastical buildings in England, reflecting the king's belief that education and religious devotion were inseparable elements of proper Christian governance. The scale of Henry's educational patronage exceeded anything attempted by previous English monarchs, and revealed both his genuine commitment to learning and his somewhat impractical approach to royal finances. The endowments established for both Eton and King's College required substantial grants of royal lands and revenues that reduced the Crown's available resources during a period of mounting financial pressure. Henry's advisers, particularly those responsible for managing royal finances, expressed concern about the wisdom of such generous grants when the kingdom faced ongoing military expenses in France and mounting domestic debts. The king's response to these concerns demonstrated his conviction that educational institutions represented investments in England's spiritual and intellectual future that justified immediate financial sacrifices. The architectural grandeur envisioned for Eton College reflected Henry's aesthetic sensibilities and his understanding of royal patronage as a means of glorifying God rather than merely enhancing monarchical prestige. The college's planned chapel, designed to accommodate elaborate liturgical ceremonies, featured soaring perpendicular Gothic architecture with extensive stained-glass windows depicting biblical scenes and royal heraldry. Henry personally supervised many design decisions, insisting on details that would create an atmosphere conducive to prayer and contemplation. The king's involvement in these architectural matters consumed considerable time and attention that his councillors believed should have been devoted to pressing political concerns. William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, emerged during this period as Henry's most trusted advisor and the primary architect of the king's peace policy toward France. Suffolk possessed extensive experience in French affairs, having served with distinction during the military campaigns of the 1420s before developing a more nuanced understanding of the strategic challenges facing English rule in France. His influence over Henry grew steadily as the king found in Suffolk a counsellor who shared his preference for diplomatic negotiation over military confrontation. Suffolk's aristocratic background and proven administrative competence made him an acceptable choice to nobles who might have resisted an advisor of lower social standing, though his advocacy for territorial concessions would eventually generate significant opposition. The peace negotiations initiated under Suffolk's guidance represented a fundamental departure from the aggressive expansionism that had characterised English policy since Henry V's accession. Suffolk's diplomatic approach acknowledged the practical limitations of English military power in France, while seeking to preserve the most strategically and economically valuable territories through negotiated settlement. His correspondence with French representatives during the early 1440s reveals a sophisticated understanding of the mutual exhaustion that prolonged warfare had created, along with recognition that both kingdoms would benefit from reduced military expenditure and increased commercial activity. The controversial policy of territorial concessions that Suffolk advocated reflected his assessment that English resources were insufficient to maintain control over the extensive French territories claimed through conquest and treaty. His proposals involved surrendering outlying English positions that required expensive garrison forces, while concentrating defensive efforts on more strategically valuable holdings such as Calais and the Norman coastal ports. This strategic retrenchment made military sense given English limitations, but it challenged fundamental assumptions about royal honour and the inviolability of territorial inheritance that had justified years of warfare and taxation. Henry's enthusiastic support for Suffolk's peace initiatives demonstrated the king's genuine desire to end the destructive warfare that had characterised Anglo-French relations throughout his lifetime. The young monarch's personal involvement in diplomatic correspondence, unusual for medieval kings who typically delegated such matters to professional diplomats, revealed his conviction that royal authority should be employed to promote Christian peace rather than territorial aggrandizement. Henry's letters to French negotiators, written in his careful script, emphasized themes of reconciliation and mutual benefit that reflected his theological understanding of kingship as a divine trust requiring moral leadership. The domestic opposition to the peace policy began forming almost immediately as news of the proposed territorial concessions spread beyond the immediate royal circle. The Duke of Gloucester, despite his reduced formal authority, retained significant influence among nobles who favoured continued military pressure on France. Gloucester's criticism of the negotiations focused on both practical concerns about English strategic position and ideological objections to surrendering territories that English soldiers had died to secure. His speeches in Parliament during this period invoked the memory of Henry V and the sacrifices made to establish English rule in France, creating emotional appeals that resonated with audiences already sceptical of diplomatic solutions. The financial implications of the peace negotiations created additional complications for royal policy, as reduced military activity in France eliminated opportunities for profitable raids and territorial conquest while failing to provide immediate relief from existing debts. The Regency period had accumulated substantial obligations to English and foreign creditors who expected repayment from French revenues that the proposed territorial concessions would eliminate. Suffolk's financial calculations suggested that long-term savings from reduced military expenditure would eventually offset these immediate losses, but the political reality required addressing current obligations with resources that the peace policy would actually diminish. Cardinal Beaufort's continued influence over royal finances provided crucial support for the peace negotiations, as his personal wealth helped bridge the gap between diplomatic aspirations and fiscal realities. Beaufort's loans to the Crown during this period carried explicit conditions requiring continued pursuit of negotiated settlement rather than renewed military campaigns. His financial leverage allowed him to support Suffolk's diplomatic initiatives while constraining potential opposition from military-minded nobles who lacked comparable resources to influence royal policy. The cardinal's advanced age and declining health, however, suggested that this financial support would not continue indefinitely. The growing unpopularity of the peace faction extended beyond immediate political circles to encompass merchants and landowners whose economic interests depended on continued English control over French territories. The wool trade, crucial to English commercial prosperity, relied heavily on access to Flemish markets that required secure passage through English-controlled French ports. Suffolk's proposed concessions threatened to disrupt these established commercial relationships, while providing no guarantee that French authorities would maintain comparable trading privileges. The economic opposition to the peace policy created a broader base of resistance that extended beyond traditional military and aristocratic concerns. Henry's personal involvement in the detailed negotiations revealed both his genuine commitment to peaceful resolution and his limited understanding of the practical complexities involved in international diplomacy. The king's insistence on including provisions for religious cooperation and cultural exchange in proposed treaties demonstrated his idealistic vision of Anglo-French relations, but these elements often complicated negotiations focused on immediate territorial and commercial concerns. His diplomatic correspondence from this period shows a monarch genuinely convinced that Christian principles could overcome the political and economic rivalries that had sustained decades of warfare. The marriage negotiations that became central to Suffolk's diplomatic strategy represented an attempt to create permanent bonds between the English and French royal families that would make future warfare politically impossible. The proposed union between Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, niece of the French Queen, offered potential advantages for both kingdoms while requiring territorial concessions that proved domestically controversial. Suffolk's advocacy for this marriage alliance reflected his belief that dynastic connections could provide more durable security than military conquest, though the specific terms he negotiated would eventually contribute to his political downfall. The administrative changes implemented during Henry's early personal rule reflected his preference for consultation and consensus over the more authoritarian approach that had characterised his father's government. The King's Council meetings, according to contemporary accounts, involved extensive discussion of policy alternatives rather than simple ratification of royal decisions. Henry's willingness to hear opposing viewpoints and his reluctance to override strong objections from experienced advisers created a more collaborative governmental process, though it also reduced the speed and decisiveness that effective medieval administration required during crisis periods. The cultural patronage that Henry extended beyond his educational foundations demonstrated his vision of monarchy as a civilizing force that should promote artistic and intellectual achievement throughout the kingdom. His support for manuscript illumination, church music, and architectural projects created employment for skilled craftsmen, while establishing aesthetic standards that influenced English cultural development for generations. The king's personal library, assembled during these years, contained extensive theological works alongside historical chronicles and philosophical treatises that reflected his scholarly interests and provided intellectual foundation for his political philosophy. The military situation in France during these years remained precarious despite the peace negotiations, as English garrisons continued to face French pressure while operating with reduced reinforcement and supply from England. The Duke of Bedford's death in 1435 had eliminated the most capable English military commander in France, leaving territorial defence to less experienced leaders who struggled to maintain morale among troops increasingly sceptical about their mission's ultimate success. The contrast between diplomatic optimism at Westminster and military reality in French territories created tensions that would eventually undermine both the peace policy and Suffolk's political position. The diplomatic machinations that culminated in Henry VI's marriage to Margaret of Anjou represented the apex of Suffolk's peace policy and simultaneously marked the beginning of its catastrophic unravelling. The negotiations, conducted in utmost secrecy throughout 1444, involved territorial concessions so substantial that Suffolk dared not reveal their full extent even to the royal council until after the marriage contract had been finalised. Margaret herself, the 15-year-old daughter of René of Anjou, brought no monetary dowry to the union, an unprecedented arrangement for a royal marriage that should have immediately raised suspicions about the true cost of the alliance. Instead, England would pay for the privilege of this French bride through the surrender of Maine and Anjou, territories that English forces had held for over 2 decades, and that represented crucial strategic positions in the defence of Normandy. The secret provisions of the marriage treaty, negotiated personally by Suffolk during his embassy to the French court, reveal the desperate lengths to which the English peace faction would go to secure a permanent settlement with France. The formal agreement signed at Tours on May 24, 1444, contained public clauses that seemed advantageous to England, including a 2-year truce and provisions for expanded commercial relations between the kingdoms. However, Suffolk had simultaneously committed England to surrendering the county of Maine to Renée of Anjou within 18 months of the marriage, while also agreeing to eventual discussions regarding the status of Anjou itself. These concessions violated explicit parliamentary instructions that had forbidden any territorial surrenders as conditions for peace negotiations. Margaret of Anjou arrived in England in March 1445 with a retinue that immediately signalled her intention to play an active role in English politics rather than serving as a decorative royal consort. Her household included experienced French courtiers and administrators who possessed intimate knowledge of continental diplomatic practices, along with personal servants whose loyalty remained directed toward French interests rather than their new English positions. The young queen's physical appearance impressed contemporary observers, who described her as possessing the dark beauty characteristic of the Angevin line, with intelligent eyes that missed little of the political undercurrents swirling around her new husband's court. Her bearing conveyed confidence and authority that contrasted sharply with Henry's gentle demeanour, creating an immediate visual representation of the dynamic that would define their relationship. The wedding ceremony held at Titchfield Abbey on April 23, 1445, proceeded with appropriate magnificence despite the underlying financial constraints that limited the scale of celebration. Henry, now 23 years old, appeared genuinely pleased with his bride, though contemporary accounts suggest his satisfaction stemmed more from relief at fulfilling his royal duty than from passionate attachment. Margaret's behaviour during the lengthy ceremonial requirements demonstrated her political acumen, as she managed to appear appropriately submissive, while clearly assessing the various court factions and their relative influence over her husband. The new Queen's immediate requests for information about English governmental procedures and her insistence on participating in council discussions revealed ambitions that extended far beyond traditional queenly roles. Margaret's influence over Henry became apparent within weeks of their marriage, as the king began displaying uncharacteristic decisiveness in implementing policies that aligned with his wife's political preferences. The Queen's daily conversations with Henry, conducted in French which she spoke fluently while his command remained limited, allowed her to present complex political arguments without interference from English courtiers who might have challenged her reasoning. Her ability to frame policy discussions in religious terms that appealed to Henry's pious nature proved particularly effective, as she consistently portrayed territorial concessions as Christian acts of mercy that would end unnecessary bloodshed between fellow believers. The revelation of the Maine surrender, which Suffolk could no longer conceal as the treaty's implementation deadlines approached, provoked immediate outrage among the English nobility and commons alike. The strategic importance of Maine extended beyond its intrinsic value to encompass its role as a buffer, protecting Normandy's southern approaches from French attack. English military commanders who had served in France understood that surrendering Maine would expose Norman territories to direct assault while eliminating defensive positions that had required years of effort and substantial financial investment to establish. The psychological impact of the concession proved equally damaging, as it represented the first voluntary surrender of territory that English forces had conquered and successfully defended. Public reaction to the territorial concessions revealed the depth of popular attachment to the French territories that Henry V had won through military conquest. London merchants who'd invested in Norman commercial ventures faced potential losses if French control disrupted established trading relationships. veteran soldiers who had served in Maine during the 1420s and 1430s expressed bitter resentment at seeing their sacrifices rendered meaningless by diplomatic agreements they had played no role in negotiating. The families of men who had died defending these territories demanded explanations for why their loved ones' deaths had apparently accomplished nothing permanent for English interests. Suffolk's attempts to justify the Maine surrender through appeals to long-term strategic benefits failed to address the immediate emotional and practical concerns raised by his critics. His arguments that reduced military commitments would allow England to concentrate resources on defending more valuable territories assumed a level of strategic sophistication that most of his audience did not possess. The Earl's emphasis on the financial savings that would result from eliminating garrison expenses ignored the reality that these costs would simply shift to strengthening defences elsewhere, rather than disappearing entirely. His assurances that French gratitude for English concessions would translate into future diplomatic cooperation struck many observers as naive, given the historical pattern of Anglo-French relations. The Queen's open support for the territorial concessions created the first serious challenge to her popularity among the English people, who had initially welcomed her arrival with genuine enthusiasm. Margaret's French birth, which had seemed merely incidental during the celebratory atmosphere surrounding her wedding, now appeared as evidence of divided loyalty that prioritised continental interests over English welfare. Her frequent consultations with French members of her household staff generated suspicions that she was providing information about English defensive preparations to potential enemies. The contrast between her confident political involvement and Henry's passive acceptance of her guidance reinforced perceptions that English policy was being directed by foreign influence rather than legitimate royal authority. The parliamentary session of 1445 witnessed unprecedented criticism of royal policy, as members who had previously supported the peace negotiations now questioned the wisdom of continuing diplomatic initiatives that seemed to benefit only French interests. The Commons' formal protests against the Maine surrender represented a direct challenge to royal prerogative in foreign affairs, establishing precedents that would complicate future diplomatic negotiations. Speaker Thomas Thorpe's carefully worded objections to the territorial concessions avoided direct criticism of the king while making clear that Parliament viewed the agreements as violations of England's fundamental interests, and contrary to the oaths that bound the monarch to preserve the realm's territorial integrity. The Duke of Gloucester's opposition to the peace policy intensified following the revelation of the secret concessions, as he recognised an opportunity to challenge Suffolk's influence while appealing to popular sentiment that favoured military resistance over diplomatic surrender. Gloucester's speeches during this period invoked the memory of Agincourt and Henry VI's other victories to argue that English military capability remained sufficient to defend all conquered territories if properly supported by royal determination. His criticism of Margaret's political involvement, while carefully avoiding direct attacks on the Queen's person, suggested that foreign influence was corrupting English decision-making processes and leading the kingdom towards dishonour and defeat. The growing polarisation between war and peace factions within the English nobility reflected fundamental disagreements about the kingdom's strategic capabilities and priorities that extended beyond immediate questions of French policy. The peace faction, led by Suffolk and supported by Cardinal Beaufort's financial resources, argued that England lacked the demographic and economic strength to maintain extensive continental commitments while simultaneously defending domestic interests against Scottish raids and potential internal rebellion. The war faction, rallying around Gloucester's leadership, contended that territorial concessions would encourage further French demands while demonstrating English weakness to other potential enemies who might then attempt their own aggressive actions. The financial calculations underlying these strategic debates reveal the extent to which England's military capabilities had been compromised by decades of expensive warfare, combined with inadequate taxation to support ongoing commitments. Suffolk's detailed accounting of military expenses, presented to justify his peace policy, demonstrated that maintaining English garrisons in France consumed approximately 40% of royal revenues while generating minimal income through taxation of occupied territories. The war factions' counter-arguments focused on the potential profits available through renewed military success, though their projections assumed levels of battlefield effectiveness that English forces had not achieved since the early 1420s. Margaret's establishment of her own political network within the English court created additional complications for the already fragmented governmental structure. The Queen's household included not only French servants, but also English nobles and administrators who saw association with her as a path to political advancement independent of traditional court hierarchies. Her ability to grant minor offices and influence major appointments gave her leverage over ambitious courtiers who might otherwise have remained neutral in factional disputes. The Queen's political activities, while not unprecedented for medieval royal consorts, operated on a scale that challenged established patterns of governmental authority and created new sources of tension within the nobility. The implementation of the main surrender proceeded despite mounting domestic opposition, as Suffolk recognised that failure to honour the treaty commitments would destroy any possibility of future diplomatic success while potentially provoking French military action at a time when English defences were inadequately prepared for renewed warfare. The evacuation of English garrisons from main fortresses required careful coordination to prevent French forces from seizing strategic positions before English troops could withdraw to secondary defensive lines. The logistical challenges of relocating military equipment and civilian administrators who had established permanent residences in the surrendered territories created additional expenses that offset some of the projected financial savings from reduced military commitments. The French reception of the territorial concessions revealed the limited extent to which English diplomatic generosity had actually improved relations between the kingdoms. Charles VII's government accepted the main surrender as partial satisfaction of legitimate French territorial claims, rather than as a generous gesture deserving reciprocal concessions from the French side. French military preparations in the newly acquired territories suggested that Charles viewed the English concessions as evidence of weakness that might be exploited through additional pressure, rather than as foundations for permanent peaceful coexistence. The rapid construction of French fortifications in former English positions demonstrated that the territorial transfers had simply shifted the military balance, rather than eliminating the underlying strategic competition. The deteriorating situation in Normandy, where English positions came under increasing French pressure following the main surrender, vindicated many of the critics' predictions about the strategic consequences of territorial concessions. French raids against Norman settlements increased in frequency and intensity as Charles VII's forces operated from newly acquired bases that provided closer access to previously secure English territories. The psychological impact on Norman populations, who had generally accepted English rule during the preceding decades, became apparent as local administrators reported increasing reluctance to cooperate with English authorities who seemed incapable of providing adequate protection against French attack. Henry's personal response to the mounting criticism of his marriage and its associated policies revealed the extent to which his political judgment remained influenced by emotional rather than strategic considerations. The king's unwavering support for his wife's political activities, despite their obvious unpopularity, demonstrated his genuine affection for Margaret while simultaneously showing his inability to separate personal relationships from governmental responsibilities. His defensive reactions to criticism of the Queen, including his dismissal of courtiers who questioned her influence, created additional political problems while failing to address the substantive concerns that motivated the opposition to his policies. The emergence of popular ballads and pamphlets criticising the royal couple's policies marked a new development in English political culture, as literate citizens began expressing political opinions through venues that reached audiences beyond the traditional boundaries of court and parliamentary politics. These informal expressions of public opinion, while lacking official status, influenced the political calculations of nobles and administrators who recognised the importance of popular support for effective governance. The contrast between the celebratory literature that had marked Margaret's arrival and the increasingly hostile popular commentary that characterised public discussion of her political activities demonstrated the speed with which royal popularity could dissipate when policies conflicted with perceived national interests. The fragile peace that Suffolk's diplomatic manoeuvring had purchased through territorial concessions began disintegrating in the spring of 1449, when French forces launched coordinated attacks against English positions throughout Normandy. The immediate catalyst came from an English raid on the Breton town of Fougères, conducted without royal authorization by François de Suchienne, a mercenary captain whose actions provided Charles VII with a pretext he had been seeking to resume full-scale hostilities. The raid itself represented everything wrong with English military organisation in France: unauthorised aggression by undisciplined commanders operating without coherent strategic direction, targeting territories that belonged to French allies rather than direct enemies. Suffolk's desperate attempts to disavow the raid and offer compensation failed to mollify French anger, as Charles VII recognised that English weakness made this an opportune moment to complete the reconquest of territories that had remained under foreign occupation for over 3 decades. The French military machine that emerged from the extended truce bore little resemblance to the disorganised forces that had struggled against English armies during the 1420s. Charles VII had used the peaceful interlude to implement comprehensive military reforms based on lessons learned from previous defeats, creating professional companies of mounted archers and artillery specialists who operated under centralised command rather than the feudal levy system that had proven so ineffective against English tactical innovations. The French artillery train, in particular, represented a technological revolution that fundamentally altered siege warfare dynamics. Master gunners like Jean Bureau had developed bronze cannons capable of breaching medieval fortifications in days rather than months, while innovations in gunpowder composition and projectile design increased both accuracy and destructive power beyond anything English defenders had previously encountered. The speed of the French advance through Normandy in the autumn of 1449 caught English commanders completely unprepared for the scale and coordination of the assault. Towns that had remained securely under English control for decades found themselves surrounded by French forces equipped with siege artillery that could reduce their walls to rubble before relief columns could organise effective responses. The psychological impact of these new weapons proved as devastating as their physical effects, as garrison commanders who had never witnessed the destructive power of modern cannons surrendered fortified positions that might have withstood traditional siege methods for months. English military doctrine, developed during the successful campaigns of Henry V, had never adequately addressed defensive strategies against artillery-supported attacks, leaving commanders without tactical frameworks for responding to the evolving military situation. The Siege of Rouen, which began in earnest during October 1449, represented both the strategic and symbolic culmination of the French reconquest of Normandy. The city's massive stone walls, strengthened during 3 decades of English occupation, had been designed to withstand traditional medieval siege techniques, including battering rams, catapults, and mining operations. However, Bureau's artillery batteries, positioned on commanding heights surrounding the city, began systematic bombardment that created breaches in multiple sections of the defensive perimeter simultaneously. The constant thunder of cannon fire, audible for miles across the Norman countryside, announced to English garrisons throughout the region that their principal stronghold was under mortal threat from weapons against which they possessed no effective defence. Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, who commanded the English forces in Normandy following the Duke of York's recall, found himself facing an impossible military situation with inadequate resources and no prospect of meaningful reinforcement from England. Somerset's correspondence with the Royal Council during the siege reveals a commander who understood the hopelessness of his position, while remaining determined to fulfill his duty regardless of personal cost. His requests for additional troops, artillery and financial support received sympathetic responses but no substantial assistance. As the English government lacked both the military resources and the political will necessary to mount an effective relief campaign. The Duke's letters described French forces numbering in the tens of thousands, supported by artillery trains that included dozens of heavy cannons, facing English garrisons that had been reduced through years of financial constraints to skeleton crews barely capable of manning defensive positions. The civilian population of Rouen, which had generally accepted English rule during the preceding decades, found their loyalties severely tested as French artillery bombardment destroyed homes, businesses and churches throughout the city. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of desperate refugees crowding into stone cellars and church crypts seeking protection from cannonballs that crashed through timber-framed buildings with devastating effect. The city's commercial districts, which had prospered under English administration, suffered particularly severe damage as French gunners deliberately targeted warehouses and market halls in efforts to break civilian morale. The psychological warfare inherent in artillery bombardment, the constant threat of sudden death from projectiles that arrived without warning, proved more effective than traditional siege starvation in undermining defender resolve. The English defensive strategy during the siege relied heavily on hopes that French forces would exhaust their gunpowder supplies or suffer equipment failures that would force them to abandon the bombardment. Somerset's military engineers attempted to construct counter-battery positions that could silence French artillery, but their efforts were hampered by shortages of cannon and experienced gunners. The few English artillery pieces available proved inferior in both range and destructive power to the French weapons, while English gunners lacked the technical expertise necessary to maintain sustained counter-battery fire. The disparity in artillery capabilities reflected broader English failures to invest in military modernisation during the peaceful years when French forces were systematically upgrading their equipment and training. The surrender of Rouen on October 29, 1449, marked the effective end of English rule in northern France and sent shockwaves throughout England that reverberated far beyond immediate military circles. Somerset's decision to capitulate came after French cannon had created multiple breaches in the city's walls that could no longer be defended against determined assault. The surrender terms, negotiated through intermediaries who recognised the hopelessness of continued resistance, allowed English garrison forces to evacuate with their personal weapons and equipment, while requiring them to swear oaths not to serve against France for specified periods. The civilian population received guarantees of personal safety and property protection, though many English administrators and merchants chose to abandon their Norman holdings rather than risk future persecution under French rule. The psychological impact of losing Rouen extended far beyond its immediate strategic consequences to challenge fundamental assumptions about English military superiority that had sustained popular support for the French wars throughout Henry VI's reign. The city had served as the administrative capital of English Normandy, housing the governmental apparatus that collected taxes, administered justice, and maintained diplomatic relations with local Norman nobility. Its loss eliminated the bureaucratic infrastructure that had made English rule in France financially viable, while simultaneously demonstrating that no English position, regardless of its apparent strength, could withstand French military pressure supported by modern artillery. The speed of the city's fall, less than 3 weeks from the beginning of serious bombardment to complete surrender, revealed the extent to which military technology had shifted the balance of power in favour of forces possessing superior firepower. News of Rohan's surrender reached London during the first week of November, arriving at Westminster Palace where Henry VI was conducting his daily religious observances in apparent ignorance of the military catastrophe unfolding across the Channel. The King's initial response to the devastating news revealed both his gentle nature and his complete inadequacy for dealing with military crises that demanded immediate decisive action. Rather than summoning his military advisers to plan emergency responses or calling Parliament to authorise additional taxation for relief expeditions, Henry withdrew to his private chapel for extended prayer sessions, seeking divine guidance for addressing the crisis. His courtiers found him kneeling before the altar for hours at a time, apparently convinced that spiritual intervention, rather than military action, represented the appropriate response to French aggression. The collapse of English resistance throughout Normandy accelerated following Rohan's surrender, as garrison commanders recognised that continued defence was futile without prospect of relief or reinforcement. Caen, Bayeux, Cherbourg, and dozens of smaller fortified positions surrendered to French forces with minimal resistance, their commanders negotiating the best possible terms for evacuation, rather than attempting hopeless defensive stands. The rapidity of these surrenders reflected not cowardice but realistic assessment of military possibilities by experienced soldiers who understood that heroic gestures would accomplish nothing beyond unnecessary casualties. French artillery, having proven its effectiveness at Rouen, served as a powerful psychological weapon that encouraged surrender negotiations before bombardment began. The financial implications of losing Normandy struck the English government with devastating force, as the territory had provided substantial tax revenues that helped offset the costs of maintaining military garrisons throughout France. The loss of Norman customs duties, land taxes and judicial fees eliminated income sources that had been factored into governmental budgeting for decades. Simultaneously, the costs of evacuating English personnel from surrendered territories and providing emergency financial support for displaced administrators created unexpected expenses that strained royal finances beyond their breaking point. The irony that Suffolk's peace policy, designed to reduce military expenditure, had ultimately resulted in massive financial losses through territorial surrenders was not lost on his political opponents. The Duke of Gloucester's response to the Norman disaster represented his final attempt to challenge the peace faction's control over royal policy through appeals to patriotic sentiment and military honour. His speeches in Parliament during the emergency session of 1450 invoke the memory of English victories at Crécy, Poitiers and Agincourt, to argue that temporary setbacks could be reversed through renewed military commitment and proper leadership. Gloucester's criticism of the territorial concessions that had preceded the French offensive resonated with audiences already predisposed to blame diplomatic weakness for military failure. His demands for Suffolk's dismissal and the appointment of more aggressive military commanders reflected genuine strategic concerns while also serving his personal political ambitions. Margaret of Anjou's reaction to the loss of her father's territories revealed the complex nature of her position as both English queen and French princess, creating conflicts of interest that her critics exploited to question her loyalty to her adopted kingdom. Her private correspondence with French relatives, intercepted by English agents, contained expressions of satisfaction at French military success that seemed to confirm suspicions about her true sympathies. The Queen's continued advocacy for peaceful negotiation, even after the Norman conquest, appeared to demonstrate either naive optimism about French intentions or deliberate sabotage of English interests. Her influence over Henry's policy decisions became a focal point for opposition forces seeking to explain England's military failures through personal rather than systemic factors. The military situation in Gascony, England's remaining major continental possession, deteriorated rapidly as French forces applied lessons learned during the Norman campaign to their southern offensive operations. The English position in southwestern France had always been more precarious than in Normandy, depending heavily on local Gascon nobility, whose loyalty to English rule was based primarily on commercial advantages rather than cultural affinity. The French conquest of Normandy eliminated the northern supply routes that had provided Gascon garrisons with reinforcements and equipment. While French naval activity in the Bay of Biscay threatened the sea communications that represented Gascony's only remaining connection to England, John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, emerged as the primary English commander responsible for defending Gascony against French assault, bringing to the task decades of military experience and a reputation for aggressive leadership that contrasted sharply with the defensive mentality that had characterised English strategy during the Norman collapse. Talbot's appointment represented Henry's belated recognition that military rather than diplomatic solutions were required to address the French threat, though the Earl received minimal resources for accomplishing his mission. His forces consisted primarily of English archers and men-at-arms, whose equipment and training reflected tactical concepts developed during the 1420s, while his French opponents possessed the artillery and professional infantry that had proven so effective in Normandy. The Siege of Bordeaux, which began in June 1451, demonstrated French ability to apply their successful Norman siege techniques to different geographical and political circumstances. The city's location on the Garonne River provided natural defensive advantages that had protected it throughout previous French attacks, while its commercial prosperity had funded substantial improvements to its fortifications during the English occupation. However, French artillery proved equally effective against Gascon stone walls as it had against Norman defences, while the city's merchant population showed little enthusiasm for enduring prolonged bombardment in defence of English political interests that seemed increasingly irrelevant to their commercial concerns. The surrender of Bordeaux on June 30th, 1451, eliminated England's primary administrative and commercial centre in southwestern France, while demonstrating that local populations would not sacrifice their lives and property to maintain English rule when faced with overwhelming French military pressure. The city's capitulation terms, similar to those negotiated at Rouen, allowed English administrators and garrison forces to evacuate with personal possessions while requiring oaths of non-belligerency for specified periods. The speed of the surrender, accomplished within weeks rather than months, reflected both the effectiveness of French artillery and the realistic assessment by Bordeaux's leaders that resistance would accomplish nothing beyond unnecessary destruction. Talbot's temporary reconquest of Bordeaux in October 1452, achieved through a surprise landing that caught French garrison forces unprepared, briefly raised English hopes that the Gascon situation might be salvaged through aggressive military action. The Earl's small expeditionary force, composed primarily of veteran English soldiers and supported by Gascon nobles who had remained loyal to English rule, successfully seized the city and several surrounding fortified positions before French relief forces could organise effective responses. The operation demonstrated that English military capabilities, while insufficient for large-scale campaigns, remained adequate for limited objectives when properly planned and executed by experienced commanders. The enthusiasm with which many Gascons welcomed Talbot's return revealed the complex nature of local loyalties in territories that had experienced both English and French rule within recent memory. Commercial considerations played crucial roles in these political calculations, as Bordeaux's wine merchants recognised that English markets provided more profitable outlets for their products than French alternatives. The city's rapid return to English allegiance suggested that popular sentiment, rather than French military intimidation, had been the primary factor in the previous year's surrender. However, the limited size of Talbot's force and the absence of significant reinforcement from England indicated that this restoration of English rule would likely prove temporary without substantial additional support. The Battle of Castillon, fought on July 17, 1453, represented the final major engagement of the 100 Years' War and demonstrated conclusively that English tactical methods developed during the 14th and early 15th centuries could not overcome French technological and organisational advantages. Talbot's decision to attack the French siege lines surrounding Castillon reflected his assessment that aggressive action offered the only possibility of breaking the systematic French conquest of remaining English positions in Gascony. The 70-year-old Earl's personal leadership of the assault demonstrated both his continued physical courage and his recognition that this battle might determine whether England retained any meaningful presence in southwestern France. The French defensive position at Castillon incorporated all the tactical innovations that had proven successful during the Norman and Gascon campaigns, including extensive use of field artillery integrated with infantry formations trained to operate in coordination with gunfire support. Bureau's artillery batteries, positioned to cover the approaches to the French siege lines, created killing zones that English cavalry and infantry could not traverse without suffering catastrophic casualties. The French had learned to use their technological advantages within tactical frameworks that maximised their effectiveness, while minimising exposure to English archery, which had historically represented the primary English advantage in continental warfare. Talbot's death during the assault on the French positions marked both the end of his personal military career and the symbolic conclusion of the English offensive capabilities in France. The Earl's body, found among the English dead after the French victory, bore wounds from both artillery projectiles and edged weapons, indicating that he had pressed forward into close combat despite the devastating effects of French gunfire. His death eliminated the most experienced and aggressive English commander remaining in France, while demonstrating that individual courage and tactical skill could not overcome the systematic military advantages that French forces had developed through technological innovation and organisational reform. The aftermath of Castillon witnessed the final collapse of English resistance in Gascony, as remaining garrison commanders recognised that continued defence was impossible without the leadership and inspiration that Talbot had provided. The Earl's death had eliminated not only a capable military commander, but also the symbolic representation of English determination to maintain continental territories regardless of cost. French forces completed their conquest of English positions throughout southwestern France within months of the battle, encountering minimal resistance from demoralised English forces whose morale had been shattered by their commander's death and the obvious futility of further military action. The retention of Calais as England's sole remaining continental possession reflected both its unique strategic value and the practical limitations of French military capabilities, rather than any fundamental English military success. The port's location provided crucial access to Flemish markets that remained essential to English commercial prosperity, while its fortifications had been systematically strengthened during decades of English occupation. French forces lacked the naval capabilities necessary to implement effective siege operations against a port that could be supplied and reinforced from the sea, while the costs of maintaining large armies in the marshy terrain surrounding Calais exceeded the strategic benefits that its conquest would provide. Henry VI's psychological response to the loss of his father's French conquests revealed the extent to which military failure had shattered his already fragile mental stability. The king's periods of catatonic withdrawal, which had occurred sporadically throughout his reign, became more frequent and prolonged following news of each territorial loss. His courtiers reported finding him sitting motionless for hours, apparently unaware of his surroundings and unresponsive to attempts at conversation. These episodes, which contemporary observers attributed to divine punishment for England's sins, represented clear symptoms of severe mental illness that rendered Henry incapable of providing the leadership that the military crisis demanded. The political consequences of the French military disasters extended far beyond immediate territorial losses, to encompass fundamental challenges to royal authority and governmental stability that would ultimately contribute to the outbreak of civil war in England. The obvious failure of Henry's peace policy, combined with his apparent mental incapacity to address the crisis, created opportunities for opposition forces to challenge Lancastrian rule while appealing to popular frustration over military humiliation. The loss of territories that English soldiers had died to conquer, combined with the financial costs of failed diplomatic initiatives, provided compelling evidence that the current governmental system was inadequate to protect English interests against foreign threats. The catastrophic news from Castillon reached Westminster Palace during the third week of August 1453, arriving at a court already reeling from months of military disasters and financial crisis. Henry VI received the dispatches reporting Talbot's death and the final collapse of English resistance in Gascony, while conducting his customary morning prayers in the royal chapel. Witnesses present described the king's initial reaction as one of stunned silence, followed by a peculiar detachment that seemed to disconnect him entirely from the gravity of the information. Rather than summoning his council to address the emergency or demanding immediate reports from surviving commanders, Henry simply continued his devotions as though the messengers had never arrived. This initial response, while consistent with his lifelong preference for spiritual over temporal concerns, marked the beginning of a mental deterioration that would render him completely incapable of governing for over a year. The king's psychological collapse manifested gradually over the following weeks, beginning with increasingly prolonged periods of silent contemplation that his courtiers initially attributed to appropriate royal grief over military defeat. Henry's daily routine, previously structured around regular council meetings and administrative duties, began fragmenting as he spent entire days in his private chambers without acknowledging the presence of servants or advisers. His personal chaplain, John Blackman, recorded that the king would sit motionless for hours, staring at religious manuscripts without turning pages or responding to questions about their content. These episodes of withdrawal became progressively longer and more complete, until by late September Henry appeared entirely unaware of his surroundings and unresponsive to all external stimuli. The complete nature of Henry's mental incapacity became undeniably apparent during the first week of October, when he failed to react to the birth of his son and heir, Prince Edward. The infant's arrival on October 13th, 1453, should have represented a moment of profound joy and political significance, as it finally provided the Lancastrian dynasty with direct male succession after years of uncertainty. Margaret of Anjou's successful delivery of a healthy son eliminated immediate concerns about dynastic continuity, while potentially strengthening the royal family's political position during a period of mounting crisis. However, Henry's complete failure to acknowledge the child's existence, even when the infant was placed directly in his arms, demonstrated that his mental condition had progressed beyond temporary grief or shock into a state of complete psychological withdrawal from reality. The king's catatonic condition presented immediate practical challenges for governmental administration that required urgent resolution despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. Medieval political theory provided no clear precedents for managing extended royal incapacity, as previous instances of monarchical inability had typically involved either brief illnesses or clear succession situations. Henry remained physically healthy and showed no signs of the violent behaviour that had characterised his grandfather Charles VI's madness, but his complete unresponsiveness made it impossible for him to fulfil even the most basic ceremonial functions of kingship. Royal documents requiring the king's personal seal remained unsigned, while diplomatic communications from foreign courts accumulated without acknowledgement or response. The Royal Council's initial attempts to conceal the extent of Henry's incapacity reflected both loyalty to the crown and recognition that public knowledge of the king's condition would create additional political instability during an already precarious period. Suffolk's death earlier that year had eliminated the peace faction's primary leader, while the Duke of Gloucester's unexpected death in February 1447 had removed the most prominent advocate for aggressive military action. The resulting power vacuum within the nobility created opportunities for ambitious figures to advance their own interests, while claiming to serve the kingdom's welfare during the crisis. The council's efforts to maintain normal governmental operations while managing the king's condition required careful coordination among members whose personal rivalries often conflicted with collective responsibilities. Cardinal Kemp, who had succeeded Beaufort as the senior ecclesiastical figure at court, assumed primary responsibility for managing the king's personal care while attempting to maintain some semblance of normal royal routine. Kemp's medical consultations with physicians experienced in treating mental disorders revealed the limited understanding that medieval medicine possessed regarding psychological conditions. The available treatments, ranging from herbal remedies designed to balance bodily humours to religious rituals intended to drive out demonic influences, proved entirely ineffective against Henry's catatonic withdrawal. The cardinal's detailed records of the king's daily behaviour during this period provide crucial documentation of symptoms that modern medical analysis would likely classify as severe catatonic depression or dissociative disorder. Margaret of Anjou's response to her husband's mental collapse demonstrated both her political acumen and her determination to protect her infant son's inheritance, despite the unprecedented circumstances. The Queen's immediate recognition that Henry's condition created a succession crisis requiring active management contrasted sharply with the Council's more passive approach to the situation. Her demands for formal recognition of Prince Edward's status as heir apparent, combined with her insistence on participating directly in governmental decisions affecting the realm's stability, revealed ambitions that extended far beyond traditional queenly roles. Margaret's French birth and her previous unpopularity among English nobles complicated her efforts to assume greater political authority, but the absence of viable alternatives gave her leverage that she exploited with considerable skill. The question of establishing a formal regency during Henry's incapacity inevitably focused attention on Richard, Duke of York, whose royal blood and administrative experience made him the most logical candidate for the protectorate. York's exclusion from court following his recall from France in 1445 had been motivated partly by his criticism of the peace policy and partly by concerns about his potential rivalry with Somerset for influence over royal appointments. However, his Plantagenet ancestry through both paternal and maternal lines provided stronger hereditary claims to governmental authority than any other available noble, while his successful administration of English territories in France during the 1440s demonstrated practical competence in managing complex political situations. York's initial reluctance to assume the protectorate reflected both genuine respect for royal prerogatives and realistic assessment of the political dangers inherent in accepting responsibility for governing during such a turbulent period. His correspondence with other nobles during the autumn of 1453 reveals a man torn between duty to the realm and awareness that failure to restore governmental effectiveness would inevitably result in personal blame for continued deterioration. The Duke's eventual acceptance of the protectorate came only after repeated parliamentary requests and formal assurances that his authority would be strictly limited to the duration of Henry's incapacity. These negotiations established important precedents for the relationship between royal authority and noble responsibility that would influence English constitutional development for generations. The formal appointment of York as protector on March 27, 1454, marked the beginning of systematic efforts to address the governmental corruption and administrative inefficiency that had accumulated during years of weak royal leadership. York's initial reforms focused on financial administration, where decades of inadequate oversight had created opportunities for embezzlement and mismanagement that significantly reduced royal revenues. His appointment of new personnel to key administrative positions eliminated many of the most egregious examples of corruption while establishing procedures designed to prevent future abuse. The Duke's methodical approach to governmental reform demonstrated both his administrative competence and his understanding that lasting improvements required systematic changes rather than dramatic gestures. The Protector's efforts to address military preparedness revealed the extent to which English defensive capabilities had deteriorated during the final years of the French wars. York's inspection of coastal fortifications discovered widespread neglect of essential maintenance, with many installations lacking adequate artillery or trained personnel to operate available weapons effectively. His emergency appropriations for military improvements, funded through more efficient collection of existing taxes rather than new levies, began addressing the most critical deficiencies while establishing longer-term programs for systematic enhancement of national defence. These military reforms reflected York's recognition that England's international position remained precarious despite the end of major continental commitments. The Duke's investigation of financial irregularities during Somerset's administration of the French territories uncovered evidence of systematic misappropriation of funds intended for military purposes. Somerset's accounts revealed discrepancies totalling thousands of pounds that had apparently been diverted from garrison pay and equipment purchases to personal expenses and unauthorised projects. York's formal charges against Somerset, while motivated partly by personal rivalry, were based on documented evidence of financial misconduct that had contributed directly to the military disasters in France. The legal proceedings against Somerset established important precedents for holding royal officials accountable for their stewardship of public resources. The Queen's opposition to York's reforms created persistent tension within the government that complicated efforts to implement systematic improvements in administrative efficiency. Margaret's protection of courtiers who had benefited from previous corrupt practices reflected both personal loyalty and recognition that York's success would diminish her own political influence. Her ability to maintain communication with the incapacitated king, even during his most withdrawn periods, provided her with unique leverage in disputes over policy direction. The Queen's French birth continued to generate suspicion about her ultimate loyalties, particularly when her positions conflicted with policies designed to strengthen English defensive capabilities. York's attempts to reform the judicial system addressed widespread complaints about corruption and favouritism that had undermined public confidence in royal justice. His appointment of new judges and legal officials eliminated many individuals whose decisions had been influenced by personal relationships rather than legal precedent. The Protector's emphasis on consistent application of existing laws rather than creation of new legal frameworks demonstrated his conservative approach to governmental reform. These judicial improvements, while limited in scope, began restoring public trust in royal institutions that had been severely damaged by years of arbitrary and corrupt administration. The financial benefits of York's administrative reforms became apparent within months of their implementation, as more efficient tax collection and reduced corruption generated substantial increases in royal revenues. The Protector's detailed accounting procedures eliminated many opportunities for embezzlement while providing clearer documentation of governmental expenses. His success in reducing the royal debt through improved financial management rather than increased taxation demonstrated that systematic administrative reform could address fiscal problems that had seemed intractable under previous management. These achievements enhanced York's political reputation while providing practical benefits that strengthened governmental stability. The gradual improvement in Henry's mental condition became noticeable during the autumn of 1454, as the king began showing intermittent awareness of his surroundings and occasional responses to direct questions. His recovery progressed slowly and unevenly, with periods of apparent lucidity alternating with episodes of withdrawal that reminded observers of his previous catatonic state. The king's first clear recognition of his infant son occurred in late November, when he reportedly spent several minutes examining the child before asking courtiers about the circumstances of the birth. This moment of parental awareness, while brief, provided hope that Henry's mental faculties might eventually return to functional levels. The king's increasing engagement with daily activities during December 1454 created anticipation throughout the court that normal royal government might soon resume. Henry's participation in religious services, while still limited compared to his previous devotional practices, demonstrated restored awareness of his surroundings and ability to follow complex ceremonial procedures. His conversations with courtiers, though brief and sometimes confused, revealed that his memory of events preceding his illness remained largely intact. The king's expressions of gratitude toward those who had cared for him during his incapacity suggested that he retained some awareness of his condition and its duration. Henry's formal resumption of royal authority on January 9, 1455, marked the end of York's protectorate and the beginning of renewed political conflict over governmental direction. The king's first official acts included pardoning Somerset and restoring him to positions of authority, decisions that directly contradicted York's reform efforts and demonstrated that Henry's recovery had not altered his fundamental political preferences. His dismissal of officials appointed by York during the Protectorate revealed either genuine disagreement with the Duke's policies or influence from courtiers who had opposed the reforms. The speed with which Henry reversed York's initiative suggested either remarkable recovery of his decision-making capabilities or continued susceptibility to manipulation by interested parties. The restoration of Somerset to royal favour created immediate tension with York and his supporters, who viewed the Duke's legal troubles as justified consequences of his administrative failures in France. Henry's apparent amnesia regarding Somerset's role in the military disasters that had precipitated the succession crisis suggested either incomplete mental recovery or deliberate choice to ignore uncomfortable realities. The king's emphasis on forgiveness and reconciliation, while consistent with his religious convictions, failed to address the practical concerns that had motivated York's reforms. This pattern of behaviour indicated that Henry's mental recovery, while sufficient to resume formal royal functions, had not fundamentally altered the personality traits that had contributed to previous governmental problems. The political realignment that followed Henry's recovery revealed the extent to which the Protectorate period had altered relationships among the English nobility. York's successful administration had attracted support from nobles who valued governmental efficiency over personal connections, creating a faction that remained loyal to his reform agenda despite his loss of formal authority. Margaret's influence over the restored king provided her with opportunities to reward supporters and punish opponents, capabilities that she exercised with considerably more political sophistication than she had demonstrated during her early years at court. The Queen's protection of French-born courtiers and her continued advocacy for diplomatic rather than military solutions to international problems maintained the factional divisions that had characterized English politics throughout the 1440s. The military implications of the governmental changes became apparent as Henry's restoration led to renewed neglect of the defensive preparations that York had initiated during his protectorate. The king's preference for reducing military expenditure, motivated by his pacifist inclinations and desire to fund religious projects, reversed many of the improvements in coastal fortifications and garrison readiness that the Duke had implemented. Somerset's return to influence over military appointments eliminated many of the personnel changes that had been designed to improve command effectiveness and reduce corruption. These reversals of York's military reforms occurred at a time when England's international position remained precarious, and domestic stability depended partly on the government's ability to maintain order through credible threat of force. The financial consequences of abandoning York's administrative reforms became apparent within months of Henry's resumption of authority, as the return of corrupt practices and inefficient procedures reduced royal revenues while increasing governmental expenses. The king's generous grants to religious institutions and courtiers eliminated much of the fiscal improvement that had been achieved through better tax collection and reduced embezzlement. Somerset's restoration to positions involving financial responsibility recreated opportunities for the misappropriation that had characterized his previous service. These developments suggested that Henry's mental recovery, while sufficient for ceremonial functions, had not enhanced his practical understanding of governmental administration or his ability to make decisions based on objective assessment of policy consequences. The stage was now set for the armed confrontation that York's supporters had hoped to avoid through constitutional means, as the Duke's exclusion from court and the reversal of his reforms eliminated peaceful options for addressing the governmental problems that had motivated his acceptance of the Protectorate. The King's apparent inability to learn from previous mistakes, combined with his continued reliance on advisers whose competence had been thoroughly discredited, created conditions that made violent conflict increasingly inevitable. The brief period of effective government during York's Protectorate had demonstrated that England's problems were not insurmountable. But Henry's restoration had also shown that sustainable solutions required either fundamental changes in royal behaviour or alternative arrangements for exercising monarchical authority. The restoration of Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, to his former positions of influence represented more than a simple reversal of York's protectorate policies. It constituted a direct challenge to the Duke's political survival and that of his supporters who had implemented the administrative reforms. Somerset's return from the Tower of London, where he had been confined pending investigation of his financial conduct in France, occurred with ceremonial fanfare that emphasised Henry's complete rejection of the charges brought against his favourite. The King's public embrace of Somerset during a court ceremony witnessed by dozens of nobles sent an unmistakable message that those who had supported York's accusations would find themselves excluded from royal favour. This dramatic rehabilitation of a man widely blamed for England's military humiliation in France demonstrated either remarkable royal forgiveness or dangerous political naivety that ignored the practical consequences of such actions. The immediate aftermath of Somerset's restoration witnessed systematic purges of officials appointed during York's protectorate, as the Duke moved swiftly to eliminate potential sources of opposition to his renewed authority. Sheriffs, customs collectors, and judicial officers who had implemented York's anti-corruption measures found themselves replaced by individuals whose primary qualifications consisted of personal loyalty to Somerset, rather than administrative competence. The speed and thoroughness of these personnel changes revealed both Somerset's organisational capabilities and his understanding that effective political control required placing trusted supporters in positions where they could influence local administration. The displaced officials, many of whom had served competently during the Protectorate, naturally gravitated toward York's political circle as they sought alternative sources of patronage and protection. York's exclusion from court following Henry's recovery created a dangerous political situation where the kingdom's most prominent noble found himself effectively banished from participation in governmental decisions despite his legitimate hereditary claims to consultation on matters of state. The Duke's withdrawal to his Yorkshire estates represented more than simple political sulking. It constituted preparation for potential military action should peaceful resolution of the crisis prove impossible. His correspondence during this period reveals careful cultivation of relationships with other nobles who shared his concerns about governmental direction, including Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, and Salisbury's son Richard, Earl of Warwick, whose combined military resources could provide formidable opposition to royal forces if circumstances required armed resistance. The Neville family's alignment with York reflected both personal relationships and shared political interests that transcended immediate factional loyalties. Salisbury had married York's sister, creating kinship bonds that reinforced political cooperation, while Warwick's extensive holdings in the Welsh Marches provided strategic positions that could control communications between England and Wales. More significantly, the Nevilles possessed military experience and resources that complemented York's own capabilities, as Salisbury had served effectively in the Scottish border campaigns, while Warwick had demonstrated administrative competence in his various governmental appointments. Their decision to support York's opposition to Somerset represented calculated assessment that their own political futures depended on preventing the Duke's complete domination of royal policy. The growing tension between the York and Somerset factions manifested in increasingly frequent disputes over appointments, land grants, and judicial decisions that reflected fundamental disagreements about governmental priorities and methods. Somerset's supporters, emboldened by their patron's restoration, began pursuing legal actions against York's adherents for alleged misconduct during the Protectorate period. These prosecutions, while technically based on legitimate legal procedures, were clearly motivated by political revenge rather than genuine concern for justice. The resulting climate of mutual suspicion and recrimination made normal political discourse increasingly difficult, as each faction viewed the other's actions through the lens of existential threat rather than routine political competition. The specific incident that precipitated armed conflict emerged from Somerset's decision to summon a Great Council meeting at Leicester for May 1455, with explicit instructions that York and his principal supporters were not to attend. This exclusion represented an unprecedented violation of established constitutional practices that guaranteed major nobles the right to participate in discussions of important state business. York's interpretation of the summons, supported by legal opinions from sympathetic scholars, characterised it as evidence that Somerset intended to use the Leicester meeting to secure formal condemnation of the Duke and his supporters for their actions during the Protectorate. The prospect of legal proceedings conducted without opportunity for defence or rebuttal left York with little choice, except armed resistance or complete political submission. York's decision to intercept the royal party travelling to Leicester reflected careful strategic calculation rather than impulsive aggression, as the Duke recognised that allowing Somerset to control the narrative at the Great Council would eliminate any possibility of peaceful resolution to their dispute. The military force that York assembled for this purpose consisted primarily of his household retainers, supplemented by contingents provided by the Nevilles, creating an army of approximately 3,000 men, equipped with the longbows and billhooks that remained standard weapons for English infantry. The Duke's choice to position his forces at St Albans, a market town strategically located on the road between London and Leicester, demonstrated both tactical awareness and understanding that public perception of the confrontation would depend partly on its apparent legitimacy as defensive rather than aggressive action. The royal army that Henry VI led toward Leicester included Somerset, the Earl of Northumberland, and Lord Clifford, along with their respective military retainers, creating a force roughly comparable in size to York's contingent, but significantly different in composition and motivation. The king's presence with the army reflected his apparent recovery from mental incapacity, though contemporary accounts suggest that Henry remained largely passive during the military preparations and seemed uncertain about the purposes of the expedition. Somerset's dominance over strategic planning became apparent as the royal forces approached St Albans, where scouts reported York's army blocking the main road in what appeared to be preparation for armed confrontation rather than negotiation. The physical layout of St Albans on the morning of May 22, 1455, provided natural advantages for defensive action that York's commanders exploited through careful positioning of their forces. The town's narrow streets, flanked by substantial timber-frame buildings and stone structures associated with the ancient abbey, created natural choke points that would channel any attacking force into confined spaces where superior numbers would provide limited advantage. York's archers, positioned on elevated ground overlooking the main approaches to the town centre, commanded clear fields of fire that would allow them to inflict significant casualties on advancing enemies before close combat began. The Duke's tactical deployment reflected both his military experience and his understanding that defensive positions would be easier to justify politically than aggressive assault on royal forces. The initial negotiations between the opposing armies revealed the extent to which personal animosity had replaced rational political discourse in the relationship between York and Somerset. The Duke's formal demands, presented through herald proclamation, called for Somerset's removal from court and his submission to legal proceedings regarding his conduct in France, conditions that the royal party rejected as treasonous interference with royal prerogative. Somerset's counter-demands required York's immediate submission and disbandment of his army, terms that would have left the Duke completely vulnerable to legal prosecution and political destruction. The failure of these preliminary negotiations demonstrated that both sides viewed the confrontation as a zero-sum contest, where compromise would constitute defeat rather than reasonable accommodation of competing interests. The Battle of St Albans began around 10 o'clock in the morning when Somerset ordered royal forces to advance through the town's main streets in an attempt to dislodge York's defensive positions. The initial assault focused on the market square where York had positioned his primary force, but the narrow approaches forced the attackers into column formation that maximised their vulnerability to archery fire from elevated positions. The distinctive sound of English longbows releasing volleys of arrows, described by contemporary witnesses as resembling the buzzing of enormous swarms of bees, filled the morning air as York's archers targeted the advancing royal troops. The effectiveness of this defensive archery, demonstrated repeatedly during the French wars, proved equally devastating against English opponents who lacked the artillery support that had given French forces advantages during recent continental campaigns. The death of Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, occurred during the early stages of the fighting when an arrow pierced his throat as he attempted to rally his men for a renewed assault on York's positions. Contemporary accounts describe Somerset fighting with a desperate courage, apparently recognising that defeat would mean either death in battle or subsequent execution for treason. His fall, witnessed by numerous combatants on both sides, eliminated the primary target of York's opposition, while simultaneously depriving the royal forces of their most experienced military commander. The psychological impact of Somerset's death extended beyond immediate tactical considerations to encompass the broader political implications of eliminating Henry's most trusted advisor through violent action that could be characterised as either legitimate resistance or treasonous rebellion. The simultaneous deaths of Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, and Thomas Clifford, Lord Clifford, during the same phase of the battle eliminated two additional pillars of Lancastrian political strength, while creating blood feuds that would influence English politics for generations. Northumberland's death from multiple arrow wounds occurred as he led a flanking attack designed to outflank York's defensive positions, demonstrating the tactical courage that had characterised the Percy family's military service throughout the Scottish border conflicts. Clifford's fall, reportedly from a crossbow bolt that penetrated his visor during close combat in the town's narrow streets, eliminated another experienced commander, whose loss significantly reduced royal military effectiveness. The concentration of noble casualties among Henry's supporters reflected both the intensity of the fighting and the political significance that both sides attached to the confrontation's outcome. King Henry's personal experience during the battle revealed both his physical courage and his complete inadequacy for military command during crisis situations. Contemporary accounts describe the king advancing with his troops during the initial assault, apparently unaware of the tactical realities that made such exposure extremely dangerous for a monarch whose capture or death would have immediate constitutional consequences. Henry's wounding by an arrow that grazed his neck, while not life-threatening, demonstrated his proximity to the actual fighting and his failure to maintain the protected position that military protocol required for royal commanders. His subsequent capture by York's forces, accomplished without additional violence once the king's vulnerability became apparent, provided the Duke with both military victory and political legitimacy for his actions. The immediate aftermath of the battle witnessed York's careful efforts to demonstrate respect for royal authority while consolidating his political victory over the Somerset faction. The Duke's personal attendance on the wounded king, including arrangements for medical treatment and comfortable accommodation, emphasised his loyalty to Henry's person, despite opposition to his policies. York's formal proclamations following the battle characterised his actions as necessary defence of the realm against corrupt advisors rather than rebellion against legitimate royal authority. This interpretation, while legally questionable given the circumstances of armed resistance to royal forces, provided political cover for nobles who might otherwise have viewed York's victory as treasonous precedent that threatened established constitutional order. The political consequences of St Albans extended far beyond immediate changes in court personnel to encompass fundamental alterations in the relationship between royal authority and noble power that would influence English constitutional development for decades. York's demonstration that armed resistance could successfully challenge royal policy, when supported by sufficient military force, established precedents that future opponents of royal decisions would invoke to justify their own rebellious actions. The battle's outcome proved that effective opposition to unpopular royal advisers required military capability rather than constitutional argument, a lesson that would encourage the militarisation of English political discourse throughout the remainder of Henry's reign. The restoration of York to his former position as protector following Henry's second mental collapse in November 1455 represented acknowledgement that the Duke's military victory had created political realities that could not be ignored through constitutional technicalities. Henry's renewed incapacity, triggered apparently by the trauma of his battlefield experience and the deaths of his closest advisers, eliminated the possibility of continued resistance to York's authority through royal prerogative. The Duke's second protectorate, while formally similar to his previous tenure, operated within a political context fundamentally altered by the demonstration that armed force could determine governmental control when constitutional methods proved inadequate. Margaret of Anjou's response to her husband's renewed incapacity and York's return to power revealed the extent to which the Queen had developed both political sophistication and personal determination during the intervening years since Henry's first breakdown. Her immediate departure from court with the infant Prince Edward demonstrated recognition that the child's safety required removal from environments where York's supporters might view him as either hostage or threat to their political control. Margaret's establishment of an alternative court in the Midlands, centred on Kenilworth Castle, and supported by nobles whose loyalty to the Lancastrian cause had been strengthened by the deaths of their colleagues at St Albans, represented the beginning of systematic resistance to York's authority that would ultimately lead to renewed civil war. The Queen's political activities during this period revealed capabilities that had been largely concealed during her earlier years at court, as she demonstrated remarkable skill in maintaining noble loyalty, despite the obvious military advantages that York's victory had provided his faction. Her correspondence with potential supporters emphasised themes of loyalty to the legitimate royal line and resistance to usurpation, arguments that resonated with nobles whose own hereditary claims to lands and titles depended on respect for established succession principles. Margaret's French birth, previously a political liability, now became an asset as she could credibly argue that English constitutional traditions required protection against innovations that threatened established governmental practices. The military preparations that both factions undertook during 1456 and 1457 reflected recognition that the St Albans precedent had made future armed conflict virtually inevitable, as neither side possessed sufficient political strength to eliminate their opponents through constitutional means alone. York's control of governmental machinery during his second protectorate provided him with access to royal revenues and official appointments that strengthened his position, but his authority remained dependent on Henry's continued incapacity and vulnerable to challenge should the king recover sufficiently to resume active rule. The Lancastrian faction's military preparations, coordinated by Margaret despite her lack of formal governmental authority, demonstrated that opposition to York's rule retained sufficient strength to mount serious resistance when circumstances permitted renewed confrontation. The attempted reconciliation orchestrated through the Loveday procession of March 25th, 1458, represented a final effort to resolve the factional conflicts through public ceremony and symbolic gestures rather than continued military confrontation. The elaborate pageant, which featured York and the Queen walking hand in hand through London streets, while the King observed from a position of honour, was designed to demonstrate restored harmony within the royal family and among the nobility. The procession's route, carefully planned to maximise public visibility, included stops at major churches where participants offered prayers for peace and national unity. Contemporary accounts describe enthusiastic popular reception for the ceremony, suggesting that ordinary citizens genuinely hoped that their social superiors had found ways to resolve their disputes without further warfare. The symbolic elements of the Loveday ceremony reveal both its political sophistication and its fundamental artificiality as a solution to conflicts rooted in incompatible ambitions and irreconcilable differences over governmental policy. The pairing of former enemies for the procession, York walking with Margaret, Warwick accompanying Somerset's heir, created visual representations of reconciliation that impressed spectators while concealing the continuing tensions that made genuine cooperation impossible. The financial arrangements for the ceremony, which required substantial expenditure on decorations, entertainment, and ceremonial expenses, demonstrated the participants' recognition that public perception of their relationships required careful management through expensive theatrical displays. The failure of the Loveday reconciliation became apparent within months, as both factions resumed military preparations and political manoeuvring that contradicted the public promises of peace and cooperation made during the ceremony. The underlying issues that had motivated the original conflict, disagreements over governmental policy, competition for royal favour, and personal animosities intensified by violent confrontation, remained unresolved despite the elaborate public displays of harmony. The ceremony's primary accomplishment consisted of providing temporary breathing space that allowed both sides to strengthen their positions for renewed conflict rather than creating genuine foundations for permanent peace. Margaret of Anjou's increasing dominance over Lancastrian strategy during 1458 and 1459 reflected both her personal capabilities and the absence of alternative leadership following the deaths of Somerset and other experienced nobles at St Albans. Her coordination of military preparations, financial arrangements, and diplomatic contacts demonstrated political skills that had been largely hidden during her earlier years as Queen Consort. The establishment of Prince Edward's household as a focal point for Lancastrian loyalty provided symbolic representation of dynastic legitimacy that complemented Margaret's practical organisational efforts. Her success in maintaining noble support despite York's control of official governmental machinery revealed both her personal persuasive abilities and the strength of traditional loyalty to established royal lines among significant portions of the English aristocracy. The Queen's efforts to secure foreign support for her cause, particularly through contacts with French and Scottish courts, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of international politics that extended far beyond the domestic focus that had characterised previous phases of the conflict. Her correspondence with French nobles, who had known her during her youth, provided access to potential military and financial assistance that could offset York's advantages in controlling English governmental resources. These diplomatic initiatives, while ultimately unsuccessful in generating substantial foreign intervention, revealed Margaret's recognition that the factional struggle had implications extending beyond immediate English political concerns to encompass broader questions of dynastic legitimacy and international stability. The military confrontation at Ludford Bridge in October 1459 represented the culmination of tensions that had been building since the Loveday ceremony's failure to create genuine reconciliation between the competing factions. The battle's location in Shropshire, near York's stronghold at Ludlow Castle, reflected the strategic importance of controlling the Welsh border regions, where the Duke's territorial influence provided natural advantages for defensive operations. The royal army that Margaret had assembled for this campaign significantly outnumbered York's forces, demonstrating her success in rallying Lancastrian supporters who viewed the confrontation as an opportunity to reverse the political consequences of St Albans through decisive military action. The defection of Andrew Trollope and the Calais garrison troops, who had initially marched with York but changed sides on the eve of battle, eliminated the Duke's primary military advantage, while demonstrating the fragility of political loyalties during periods of civil conflict. Trollope's decision to lead his experienced soldiers over to the royal army reflected both personal calculation about the likely outcome of the confrontation and professional assessment that continued resistance to overwhelming royal forces would accomplish nothing beyond unnecessary casualties. The psychological impact of this defection on York's remaining supporters proved as devastating as its immediate military consequences, as it suggested that even the Duke's most trusted subordinates doubted the wisdom of continued opposition to royal authority. York's decision to flee England rather than face certain defeat at Ludford Bridge represented realistic assessment of military possibilities rather than personal cowardice, though his abandonment of the field provided his enemies with propaganda opportunities that they exploited effectively in subsequent political discourse. The Duke's escape to Ireland, accompanied by his second son Edmund, Earl of Rutland, eliminated immediate threats to his personal safety while providing time to reassess strategic options from a secure base where his authority as Lord Lieutenant remained largely unchallenged. His eldest son Edward, Earl of March, along with the Nevilles, chose exile in Calais, where their control of the garrison provided both security and potential launching point for future military operations against the Lancastrian government. The Parliament that convened at Coventry in November 1459, dominated by Margaret's supporters and meeting in a location chosen to emphasise Lancastrian strength in the Midlands, formally condemned York and his principal adherents as traitors whose actions at St Albans and Ludford Bridge had violated their oaths of allegiance to the Crown. The Acts of Attainder passed against the Yorkist leaders confiscated their lands, eliminated their titles, and condemned them to death should they return to England without royal pardon. These legal proceedings, while constitutionally questionable given the circumstances of their passage, provided Margaret with powerful weapons for consolidating Lancastrian control while eliminating the territorial bases that had supported York's political influence. The temporary triumph of the Lancastrian cause following Ludford Bridge created opportunities for Margaret to implement policies that reflected her own political priorities rather than the compromises that had characterised previous periods when York's opposition had constrained royal freedom of action. Her appointments to major governmental positions emphasised loyalty to the dynasty over administrative competence, creating a court culture that prioritised personal relationships over objective assessment of policy effectiveness. The Queen's French birth and her continued contacts with continental courts generated suspicions about foreign influence over English policy that her political opponents would exploit when circumstances permitted their return to active opposition. The financial implications of the Yorkist exile, combined with the costs of maintaining military preparedness against potential invasion, created mounting pressure on royal resources that threatened the stability of Margaret's political control. The confiscated Yorkist estates, while valuable in theory, proved difficult to administer effectively without cooperation from local populations, who often retained loyalty to their former lords. The need to garrison strategic positions against possible Yorkist return required military expenditure that strained governmental finances while providing limited productive benefit to the realm's overall economic welfare. These practical challenges suggested that Margaret's political victory, while complete in immediate terms, remained vulnerable to future developments that might alter the balance of military and financial resources available to the competing factions. The Yorkist exiles' return from their continental refuges began with careful coordination between the separate power bases that York had established in Ireland and his son Edward controlled from Calais. Throughout the winter months of 1459 to 1460, messengers travelled secretly between Dublin and the English garrison town, carrying detailed plans for simultaneous invasions that would stretch Lancastrian defensive resources beyond their capabilities. York's position in Ireland had proven remarkably secure, as his authority as Lord Lieutenant commanded genuine respect among the Anglo-Irish nobility, who valued effective governance over dynastic loyalty to distant English monarchs. The Irish Parliament's formal support for York's cause, expressed through generous financial grants and military levies, provided him with resources that Margaret's government could not effectively counter without diverting substantial forces from English defensive requirements. The Earl of Warwick's control over Calais had proven equally valuable, as the strategic port provided not only a secure base for Yorkist operations, but also access to continental diplomatic contacts and commercial relationships that generated both intelligence and financial support. Warwick's naval activities during the spring of 1460, including raids against Lancastrian shipping and the capture of several vessels carrying supplies to royal forces, demonstrated the military advantages that control of England's primary continental outposts provided to York's cause. The Earl's ability to recruit experienced soldiers from among the Calais garrison, supplemented by Flemish mercenaries whose services could be purchased with profits from maritime raids, created a professional military force that contrasted sharply with the feudal levies that comprised the bulk of Margaret's defensive preparations. The coordination between these separate Yorkist power bases culminated in York's landing at Red Bank near Chester on June 7, 1460, followed within days by Warwick's invasion force crossing from Calais to the Kentish coast. The timing of these simultaneous operations reflected careful strategic planning designed to prevent Margaret's forces from concentrating against either invasion separately. York's choice of Chester as his landing site demonstrated understanding of regional politics, as the Palatine County's traditional autonomy from central governmental control provided natural advantages for establishing a secure foothold on English soil. The enthusiastic reception that greeted York's return, including formal declarations of support from prominent Cheshire landowners, suggested that popular sentiment in the northwest remained favourable to his cause despite the previous year's military setbacks. Warwick's landing at Sandwich on June 26th encountered minimal resistance, as the Lancastrian garrison fled without offering battle when confronted by the Earl's experienced troops. The rapid advance of Yorkist forces through Kent revealed the extent to which Margaret's government had failed as to maintain effective defensive preparations in regions distant from their Midland strongholds. Local populations, many of whom had suffered from increased taxation and military requisitions imposed to fund the government's defensive measures, welcomed Warwick's army as liberators rather than invaders. The Earl's careful treatment of civilian populations during his advance, including strict discipline imposed on his troops to prevent looting and violence, contrasted favourably with the behaviour of Lancastrian forces, whose exactions had generated widespread resentment. The convergence of the two Yorkist armies near Northampton created a combined force of approximately 25,000 men, representing the largest military concentration that York's faction had achieved since the beginning of the civil conflict. The professional quality of many of these troops, particularly those drawn from the Calais garrison and Irish military establishments, provided significant advantages over the hastily assembled feudal levies that comprised much of Margaret's defensive force. Warwick's artillery train, transported from Calais and supplemented by captured Lancastrian guns, included several heavy cannons whose firepower could breach medieval fortifications that might otherwise have provided secure defensive positions for royal forces. King Henry's presence with the Lancastrian army that assembled to meet the Yorkist advance reflected Margaret's recognition that royal authority provided crucial legitimacy for military operations against subjects who could otherwise claim to be defending the realm against usurpation. The king's mental condition during this period remained fragile, with contemporary accounts describing episodes of confusion and withdrawal that required careful management by his attendants to maintain the appearance of competent royal leadership. Henry's physical courage, demonstrated previously at St Albans, remained intact despite his psychological difficulties, though his tactical understanding of military situations continued to prove inadequate for effective command during complex operations. The defensive position that Lancastrian forces established at Northampton reflected both the strategic importance of controlling the major road networks converging on the town and the natural advantages provided by the River Nene's course through the surrounding countryside. The Royal Army's entrenchments, constructed according to established military engineering principles, included earthwork fortifications reinforced with timber palisades and protected by ditches designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. The positioning of Lancastrian artillery within these defensive works created overlapping fields of fire that should have devastated any frontal assault, while the swampy ground adjacent to the river prevented effective flanking manoeuvres by cavalry forces. The Battle of Northampton commenced on July 10, 1460, during a heavy rainstorm that significantly affected the tactical capabilities of both armies, while creating conditions that favoured the attacking Yorkist forces. The persistent rainfall rendered much of the Lancastrian artillery ineffective, as wet gunpowder failed to ignite properly and waterlogged cannon mechanisms proved difficult to operate under battlefield conditions. The muddy ground that resulted from the downpour actually aided Yorkist infantry advancing against the defensive positions, as it provided better footing than the defenders had anticipated, while filling the protective ditches that were supposed to channel attackers into vulnerable positions. The decisive moment of the battle occurred when Edmund Grey, Lord Grey de Ruthin, commanding a significant portion of the Lancastrian left flank, ordered his troops to lay down their arms and allow Yorkist forces to pass through their defensive positions without resistance. Grey's treachery, apparently motivated by secret negotiations with Warwick conducted during the preceding weeks, eliminated a crucial section of the royal defensive line while providing Yorkist troops with direct access to the rear areas where Henry's headquarters had been established. The psychological impact of this betrayal proved as devastating as its immediate tactical consequences, as other Lancastrian commanders questioned whether their own subordinates might have been similarly compromised. King Henry's capture during the confused fighting that followed Grey's betrayal occurred when royal bodyguards, overwhelmed by Yorkist troops advancing from unexpected directions, abandoned their defensive positions around the king's tent. Contemporary accounts describe Henry sitting calmly in his pavilion, apparently unaware of the military disaster unfolding around him, until Warwick's soldiers arrived to escort him to safety under Yorkist protection. The king's passive acceptance of his changed circumstances, including his apparent lack of distress at the deaths of his supporters, who had died attempting to defend him, demonstrated either remarkable philosophical resignation or continued psychological detachment from the realities of his political situation. The casualties suffered by Lancastrian forces at Northampton included several prominent nobles, whose deaths eliminated key pillars of Margaret's political coalition, while creating additional blood feuds that would influence future phases of the civil conflict. Humphrey Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, died fighting in the defensive trenches where his personal courage could not overcome the tactical disadvantages created by Grey's betrayal and the failure of artillery support. John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, son of the hero of Castile, fell defending the approaches to the king's position, demonstrating the same family commitment to royal service that had characterised his father's military career. These noble deaths, concentrated among Henry's most loyal supporters, significantly weakened the Lancastrian cause, while providing Yorkist propaganda with evidence that divine judgment favoured their political objectives. Margaret of Anjou's escape from the battlefield, accomplished with the assistance of loyal retainers who recognised that her capture would have eliminated any possibility of continued Lancastrian resistance, preserved the most capable leader remaining to Henry's cause. The Queen's flight northward towards Scotland, accompanied by Prince Edward and a small group of devoted supporters, represented both immediate tactical necessity and longer-term strategic planning for continued opposition to Yorkist control. Her decision to seek refuge in Scottish territory reflected realistic assessment that English strongholds would prove vulnerable to Yorkist siege operations, while foreign sanctuary would provide time and security necessary for organising future resistance efforts. York's controversial decision to claim the throne directly, rather than continuing to govern through control over Henry's person, emerged from his recognition that the repeated cycles of royal recovery and renewed conflict made constitutional solutions impossible. The Duke's dramatic entrance into the Parliament chamber at Westminster on October 10th, 1460, with his hand resting on the throne while his supporters displayed the royal arms of England, represented a fundamental escalation of his political objectives that shocked even his closest allies. His formal claim to the crown, based on his descent from Edward III through both paternal and maternal lines, challenged not only Henry VI personally, but the entire Lancastrian dynasty's legitimacy since Henry IV's usurpation of Richard II. The genealogical arguments that York's supporters presented to justify his claim revealed sophisticated understanding of hereditary law, while exposing the constitutional weaknesses that had characterised English royal succession since the 14th century. Their detailed charts demonstrating York's superior bloodline through Lionel of Antwerp, Edward III's second son, contrasted with Henry's descent through John of Gaunt, the third son, provided compelling evidence for audiences who valued strict hereditary principles over parliamentary recognition or military conquest. The legal precedents cited by York's advocates, including cases from French succession law and earlier English disputes over inheritance rights, demonstrated the international dimensions of dynastic legitimacy that extended beyond purely domestic political considerations. The parliamentary debate that followed York's claim revealed deep divisions among the English nobility regarding the fundamental principles that should govern royal succession during periods of dynastic dispute. The Lords Spiritual, led by the Archbishop of Canterbury, expressed grave concerns about the precedent that successful rebellion against anointed monarchs would establish for future challenges to royal authority. Their theological arguments emphasized the sacred nature of royal coronation and the divine sanction that protected legitimate monarchs from earthly challenges to their authority. The temporal lords found themselves divided between recognition of York's superior hereditary claims and concern about the practical consequences of deposing a king who retained significant popular support in many regions. The Act of Accord, negotiated during late October 1460, represented a compromise solution that attempted to balance York's hereditary claims against the practical difficulties of immediate deposition, while Henry remained alive and capable of inspiring continued resistance. The agreement's provisions recognised York as Henry's heir apparent, while allowing the current king to retain his title and ceremonial authority for the remainder of his natural life. Prince Edward's disinheritance, formalised through parliamentary statute, eliminated the Lancastrian succession while providing York's line with legal recognition of their future rights. This constitutional arrangement, while unprecedented in English history, offered potential resolution of the dynastic dispute without requiring immediate military action to enforce York's claims. Henry's apparent acceptance of his son's disinheritance demonstrated either remarkable personal humility or continued psychological detachment from political realities that most contemporary observers found difficult to comprehend. The king's public statements during the parliamentary proceedings emphasised themes of peace and reconciliation that ignored the obvious impossibility of genuine cooperation between factions whose fundamental interests remained irreconcilably opposed. His expressions of satisfaction with the arrangement, including his apparent relief at being freed from the burdens of active governance, suggested that his mental condition continued to affect his understanding of the political implications of the decisions being made in his name. Margaret of Anjou's response to the Act of Accord, communicated through messengers who maintained contact between her Scottish refuge and supporters remaining in England, rejected the agreement's legitimacy while declaring her intention to restore her son's inheritance through military action. The Queen's denunciation of the parliamentary proceedings as invalid due to her absence and the coercion applied to her husband revealed both her legal sophistication and her determination to continue resistance, regardless of constitutional formalities. Her success in maintaining communication networks that extended throughout northern England demonstrated organisational capabilities that would prove crucial for coordinating future Lancastrian military operations. The military preparations that both factions undertook during November and December 1460 reflected recognition that the Act of Accord had failed to provide genuine resolution of the dynastic dispute, as Margaret's rejection of its terms made renewed warfare inevitable. York's decision to march northward with a relatively small force to secure his estates and confront Lancastrian resistance demonstrated either overconfidence in his political position or dangerous underestimation of the military capabilities that Margaret had assembled during her Scottish exile. His division of available Yorkist forces, leaving substantial contingents in London and the south while advancing into hostile territory with inadequate support, violated basic strategic principles that his military experience should have emphasised. The assembly of Lancastrian forces in the north during December 1460 revealed both the continued strength of dynastic loyalty among significant portions of the English nobility and the effectiveness of Margaret's organisational efforts during her months of exile. The Queen's success in coordinating military contributions from Scottish allies, northern English lords who had remained loyal to Henry's cause, and Welsh supporters who opposed Yorkist control demonstrated political and diplomatic skills that had been largely concealed during her earlier years as Queen Consort. The combined army that gathered around her standard included not only English feudal levies, but also Scottish professional soldiers whose experience in border warfare provided tactical advantages that complemented the numerical superiority of Lancastrian forces. The Battle of Wakefield, fought on December 30th, 1460, represented the culmination of tactical errors and strategic miscalculations that had characterised York's northern campaign from its inception. The Duke's decision to accept battle despite being significantly outnumbered reflected either desperation born of recognition that retreat was impossible, or continued overconfidence in the superior quality of his troops. The battlefield itself, located near Sandal Castle where York had established his headquarters, provided natural advantages for defensive operations that the Duke failed to exploit effectively due to the aggressive tactics that had served him well in previous engagements, but proved disastrous when facing superior enemy numbers. York's death during the battle, along with that of his second son Edmund, Earl of Rutland, eliminated the primary leadership of the Yorkist cause, while providing Margaret's forces with both military victory and powerful symbols of divine judgment in favour of the Lancastrian dynasty. Contemporary accounts describe York fighting with desperate courage after recognising that the battle was lost, apparently seeking honourable death rather than capture and subsequent execution. His severed head, displayed on the gates of York City crowned with a paper crown in mockery of his royal pretensions, provided Margaret's supporters with tangible evidence of their triumph while serving as a warning to other potential challengers of Lancastrian authority. The psychological impact of Wakefield extended far beyond its immediate military consequences to encompass fundamental alterations in the character and objectives of the civil conflict that would influence all subsequent phases of the struggle. The personal nature of the casualties, including not only York himself, but also his young son, whose death violated established conventions regarding the treatment of noble prisoners, transformed what had been primarily a political dispute into a blood feud that demanded vengeance rather than accommodation. The brutal treatment of Yorkist dead, including the public display of severed heads and the denial of proper burial rites, demonstrated that the conflict had entered a new phase, where traditional chivalric restraints no longer constrained the behaviour of either faction. Edward, Earl of March, inherited both his father's titles and his claims to the throne at the age of 18, facing the enormous challenge of maintaining Yorkist resistance against Lancastrian forces that had demonstrated decisive military superiority. The young Earl's initial response to news of his father's death revealed both the personal grief that motivated his subsequent actions and the political acumen that would characterise his approach to the dynastic struggle. His immediate efforts to secure the Welsh border regions, where his family's territorial influence provided natural advantages for defensive operations, demonstrated strategic understanding that complemented the aggressive temperament he had inherited from his father. The Battle of Mortimer's Cross, fought on February 2, 1461, represented Edward's first independent military command and demonstrated tactical capabilities that exceeded those displayed by his father during the Wakefield campaign. The young Earl's victory over a combined Welsh and Irish force led by Jasper Tudor, Earl of Pembroke, and James Butler, Earl of Wiltshire, eliminated immediate threats to Yorkist positions in the Welsh marches while providing Edward with military credibility, essential for maintaining noble support during the crisis following his father's death. The battle's most memorable feature, a parhelion or sun-dog that appeared in the winter sky before the fighting began, provided Edward with a powerful propaganda symbol that he would incorporate into his personal heraldry as the sun in splendour. Margaret's advance southward, following the Wakefield victory, represented the high point of Lancastrian military success during the entire civil conflict, as her army swept aside scattered Yorkist resistance while advancing towards London with apparent unstoppable momentum. The Queen's forces, swollen by Scottish allies and northern English levies motivated by prospects of southern plunder, numbered perhaps 30,000 men and included substantial contingents of experienced soldiers whose recent victory had enhanced their confidence and cohesion. The speed of the Lancastrian advance, covering over 200 miles in less than 6 weeks during the depths of winter, demonstrated both the organisational capabilities that Margaret had developed and the military effectiveness of her combined English and Scottish forces. The Second Battle of St Albans, fought on February 17, 1461, witnessed the temporary restoration of Henry VI to personal freedom and nominal authority, as Margaret's forces defeated the Earl of Warwick's army that had been positioned to defend the approaches to London. Warwick's tactical dispositions, based on defensive positions similar to those that had proven successful during the first battle at the same location, failed to account for the superior numbers and enhanced military capabilities that characterised the Lancastrian army of 1461. The Earl's use of innovative defensive devices, including spiked barriers and portable artillery pieces designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones, proved inadequate against determined assault by troops whose recent victories had eliminated their previous reluctance to engage Yorkist forces in direct combat. Henry's behaviour during and immediately after the battle revealed both the persistence of his mental difficulties and his genuine affection for his wife and son, whose reunion with him provided one of the few moments of apparent happiness in his troubled reign. Contemporary accounts describe the king's confusion about the circumstances that had led to his presence on the battlefield, along with his expressions of concern for the welfare of soldiers on both sides who had died in what he apparently viewed as unnecessary conflict. His immediate pardoning of captured Yorkist soldiers, including several who had been directly involved in his previous detention, demonstrated the merciful temperament that had characterised his approach to political opponents throughout his reign, while simultaneously frustrating Margaret's efforts to eliminate future sources of resistance through exemplary punishment. The Lancastrian army's failure to advance immediately on London following their victory at St Albans represented a crucial strategic error that allowed Edward to consolidate his position and prepare for the decisive confrontation that would determine the ultimate outcome of the dynastic struggle. Margaret's decision to halt her advance, apparently motivated by concerns about maintaining discipline among her northern and Scottish troops in the wealthy southern counties, provided her enemies with time to recover from their defeat while organising more effective resistance. The delay also allowed Yorkist propaganda to exploit fears about Scottish depredations and northern violence that had been generated by reports of the army's behaviour during its southward march. Edward's arrival in London on February 26, 1461, marked the beginning of his transformation from regional magnate to national leader, as he successfully appealed to popular sentiment that favoured strong leadership over the continued chaos that characterised Lancastrian rule. The enthusiastic reception that greeted his entry into the capital reflected both genuine popular support and careful orchestration by his supporters who recognised the importance of demonstrating public endorsement for his cause. His immediate proclamation as King Edward IV, while constitutionally questionable given the absence of formal parliamentary approval, represented practical recognition that military success rather than legal technicalities would determine the ultimate resolution of the dynastic dispute. The coronation ceremony, hastily organised for March 4th, 1461, provided Edward with the religious legitimacy that complemented his military achievements while creating irreversible commitment to his royal claims. The service, conducted by the Bishop of Exeter in the absence of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who remained loyal to Henry VI, included all the essential elements of traditional English coronation ritual while acknowledging the unusual circumstances that had brought Edward to the throne. The young king's bearing during the lengthy ceremony impressed contemporary observers, who noted his apparent comfort with the ceremonial requirements and his confident assumption of royal dignity despite his youth and the controversial nature of his accession. The military preparations that followed Edward's coronation reflected his recognition that permanent security for his reign required decisive defeat of Lancastrian forces rather than continued defensive operations that left his enemies free to organise future challenges to his authority. The army that assembled under his command during March 1461 represented the largest and most professional military force that any faction had fielded during the civil conflict, including not only traditional feudal levies, but also substantial numbers of experienced soldiers recruited through cash payments rather than feudal obligation. Edward's personal wealth, derived from his extensive territorial holdings and enhanced by confiscation from defeated enemies, provided financial resources that allowed him to maintain military forces on a scale that exceeded anything his predecessors had achieved. The strategic situation that confronted both armies as they prepared for what all participants recognised would be the decisive battle of the Civil War reflected the fundamental transformation that the conflict had undergone since its origins in disputes over governmental policy and royal advisers. The personal nature of the struggle, intensified by the brutal deaths at Wakefield and the accumulated grievances of 5 years of intermittent warfare, had created conditions where compromise or accommodation had become impossible for either faction. Edward's youth and energy, combined with his military successes and popular support in London and the South, provided him with advantages that complemented the superior numbers and recent victories that characterised Margaret's position. The approaching confrontation would determine not only the immediate resolution of the dynastic dispute, but also the fundamental character of English monarchy for generations to come. The crushing defeat at Towton on March 29, 1461, scattered the Lancastrian forces across the Yorkshire countryside in a rout so complete that organised resistance seemed impossible. Margaret of Anjou, witnessing the destruction of her army from a vantage point near the battlefield, faced the stark reality that her cause had suffered a catastrophe from which recovery would require nothing short of miraculous intervention. The Queen's immediate flight northward, with her husband and young son, represented not merely tactical retreat, but the beginning of a desperate exile that would test every resource of determination and political skill she possessed. Henry VI, still displaying the mental fragility that had characterised his recent years, appeared barely conscious of the magnitude of the disaster as his small party of loyal retainers guided him away from the scene of Yorkist triumph toward the uncertain sanctuary of the Scottish border. The journey to Scotland proceeded through hostile territory where Edward IV's supporters controlled most major strongholds, and his patrols scoured the countryside for fleeing Lancastrian nobles. Margaret's party, reduced to fewer than 40 mounted followers, avoided main roads and travelled primarily at night to minimise the risk of capture. The Queen's personal baggage, hastily assembled during the retreat from Towton, included the crown jewels and important state documents that she hoped might serve as diplomatic assets in negotiations with foreign allies. Henry's condition during this arduous journey alternated between periods of apparent awareness and episodes of complete withdrawal, requiring his attendants to guide his horse manually when he became unresponsive to external stimuli. The contrast between the royal family's current circumstances and their previous magnificence could not have been more stark. The anointed King of England reduced to a fugitive dependent on the charity of Scottish border lords for basic sustenance. The Scottish court's reception of the exiled Lancastrian royal family reflected the complex diplomatic calculations that governed Anglo-Scottish relations throughout the 15th century. James III, still a minor under the regency of his mother Mary of Guelders, viewed the English dynastic conflict as an opportunity to advance Scottish territorial ambitions while weakening their traditional enemies through continued civil warfare. The regent's decision to provide sanctuary for Henry and Margaret carried obvious risks, as it virtually guaranteed hostile relations with Edward IV's government, but it also offered potential rewards if Lancastrian restoration could be achieved through Scottish military assistance. Mary of Guelders, herself a foreign-born queen who had faced challenges in establishing her authority, demonstrated particular sympathy for Margaret's situation, while recognising the propaganda value of harbouring the legitimate English royal family. The establishment of the Lancastrian court in exile at Edinburgh Castle created a bizarre situation where two separate governments claimed authority over England, while one operated from foreign territory with minimal resources. Margaret's household, reduced to essential personnel and dependent on Scottish hospitality, maintained the ceremonial forms of royal administration, despite lacking any practical means of implementing governmental decisions. Henry continued to issue charters and patents under the Great Seal that had been preserved during the flight from Towton, though these documents possessed no legal validity in territories controlled by Edward IV's administration. The psychological importance of maintaining these governmental routines extended beyond mere propaganda to encompass Margaret's efforts to preserve Henry's mental stability through familiar activities that provided structure to his increasingly confused existence. The Queen's diplomatic initiatives during the summer of 1461 revealed both her sophisticated understanding of international politics and her willingness to make substantial territorial concessions in exchange for military support. Her negotiations with Louis V of France, recently ascended to the throne and eager to exploit English weakness for French advantage, involved offers to surrender Calais in return for French military intervention against Edward IV. These discussions, conducted through intermediaries who travelled between Edinburgh and the French court, demonstrated Margaret's recognition that Lancastrian restoration would require foreign assistance on a scale that only major European powers could provide. The French king's cautious response reflected his assessment that direct intervention in English affairs carried significant risks, while the ultimate outcome of the civil conflict remained uncertain. The series of Lancastrian uprisings that erupted throughout northern England during 1461 and 1462 represented desperate attempts to capitalise on regional loyalty to the deposed dynasty, while Edward IV's government remained preoccupied with consolidating control over the kingdom's administrative apparatus. The most significant of these rebellions occurred in Northumberland, where the Percy family's traditional influence provided natural leadership for resistance to Yorkist rule. Henry Percy, the new Earl of Northumberland following his father's death at St Albans, had escaped Towton and maintained communication with Margaret's court while organising guerrilla operations against Yorkist garrisons. His forces, composed primarily of border rovers and tenant farmers loyal to the Percy name, possessed intimate knowledge of the region's terrain that compensated for their lack of heavy equipment and professional military training. The siege of Bamborough Castle during August 1462 demonstrated both the persistence of Lancastrian resistance and the ultimate futility of isolated strongholds attempting to maintain independence against superior Yorkist resources. The fortress, one of the most formidable in northern England, had been garrisoned by Scottish troops provided through Mary of Guelder's support for the Lancastrian cause. The castle's position on the Northumberland coast allowed resupply from Scottish vessels, while its massive stone walls provided protection against conventional siege techniques. However, Edward IV's deployment of heavy artillery, including the great bombard Newcastle, capable of breaching medieval fortifications, demonstrated the technological advantages that his government could bring to bear against isolated resistance centres. The systematic bombardment that reduced sections of Bamborough's walls to rubble within weeks illustrated the evolution of siege warfare that made traditional castle defences increasingly obsolete. Margaret's personal involvement in coordinating these northern uprisings required dangerous journeys across the Scottish border that exposed her to capture while demonstrating her continued commitment to active leadership of the Lancastrian cause. Her clandestine meetings with English supporters, conducted in remote border locations under cover of darkness, revealed both her physical courage and her understanding that successful resistance required personal inspiration that could not be provided through distant correspondence. The Queen's ability to maintain morale among dispirited followers, many of whom had lost lands and titles through Yorkist confiscations, demonstrated leadership qualities that had been largely concealed during her earlier years as consort to an ineffective king. Her promises of restoration and revenge, while based more on hope than realistic assessment of available resources, provided psychological sustenance that kept Lancastrian resistance alive during its darkest period. The gradual erosion of Lancastrian support throughout the northern counties reflected both the effectiveness of Edward IV's administrative appointments and the practical benefits that his government provided to populations exhausted by years of civil warfare. The new king's policy of pardoning former enemies who submitted voluntarily, combined with his restoration of normal commercial activity and judicial administration, created incentives for accommodation that many previously loyal Lancastrians found increasingly attractive. Local landowners who had initially supported Henry VI from dynastic loyalty began calculating that their family's long-term interests required acceptance of Yorkist rule, particularly as Lancastrian military prospects continued to deteriorate with each failed uprising. The defection of prominent northern families, including some with hereditary ties to the Lancastrian cause, eliminated crucial sources of local leadership and financial support that had sustained earlier resistance efforts. Henry's capture near Clitheroe in July 1465 occurred during one of his increasingly frequent episodes of mental confusion, when he had wandered away from his protective escort while apparently believing himself to be on a pilgrimage to local religious shrines. The former king's appearance when discovered by Yorkist agents shocked even his captors, as his clothing was tattered and his personal hygiene reflected months of inadequate care during his fugitive existence. Contemporary accounts describe Henry as initially unaware of his captor's identity or the significance of his situation, responding to questions about his whereabouts with rambling discussions of religious visions and scriptural interpretations. The absence of any armed resistance during his capture reflected both his peaceful nature and the complete collapse of organised Lancastrian military protection in the regions where he had been hiding. The transfer of Henry VI to the Tower of London represented Edward IV's recognition that his predecessor's continued existence posed ongoing threats to governmental stability, while his execution would create martyrdom that might inspire renewed resistance. The former king's imprisonment in comfortable quarters within the tower, including access to religious books and regular visits from sympathetic clergy, demonstrated Edward's attempt to balance security requirements with respect for Henry's royal dignity and obvious mental incapacity. The psychological impact of Henry's captivity extended beyond immediate political considerations to encompass broader questions about the treatment of deposed monarchs and the responsibilities that successful usurpers bore toward their predecessors. Edward's decision to maintain Henry in honourable confinement, rather than eliminating him through execution or assassination, reflected both political calculation and genuine concern for establishing precedents that might protect his own dynasty, should future circumstances require similar arrangements. Margaret's response to her husband's capture revealed both her personal anguish and her determination to continue resistance, despite the elimination of the symbolic figurehead around whom Lancastrian loyalty had traditionally organised. Her immediate departure from Scottish territory for the French court reflected recognition that Henry's imprisonment had fundamentally altered the dynamics of her cause, requiring new strategies that emphasised her son Prince Edward's claims rather than restoration of his father's active rule. The Queen's journey to France, accomplished with minimal escort and substantial personal danger, demonstrated both her diplomatic sophistication and her understanding that Lancastrian survival now depended entirely on foreign military intervention that only major European powers could provide. The French court's reception of Margaret during the autumn of 1465 reflected Louis XV's evolving assessment of English affairs and his recognition that the Lancastrian cause might serve French strategic interests despite its apparent military hopelessness. The Spider King's reputation for diplomatic cunning was well established, and his willingness to provide Margaret with financial support and political sanctuary reflected calculation rather than sympathy for her personal circumstances. Louis's strategic thinking encompassed both immediate advantages that English civil warfare provided for French territorial ambitions and longer-term possibilities for manipulating English politics through support for competing dynastic claimants. The financial subsidies that he provided to Margaret, while modest by royal standards, proved crucial for maintaining her household and funding the diplomatic activities necessary for organising future resistance efforts. The education and training of Prince Edward during his exile in France became central to Margaret's long-term planning for Lancastrian restoration, as she recognised that her son's eventual assumption of leadership would require capabilities that his father had never possessed. The young prince's instruction in military arts, conducted by experienced French commanders who had served in recent campaigns against Burgundian and English forces, provided him with practical knowledge of contemporary warfare that complemented his theoretical education in statecraft and diplomacy. His linguistic abilities, enhanced through daily exposure to French court culture, equipped him for the international negotiations that would be essential for securing foreign support for his dynastic claims. The contrast between Edward's rigorous preparation for kingship and his father's gentle scholarly inclinations suggested that Margaret had learned important lessons about the practical requirements for effective royal leadership. The diplomatic revolution that brought Margaret into alliance with Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, represented one of the most unexpected developments in the entire history of the civil wars, as it united former enemies whose previous conflicts had been characterised by exceptional bitterness and personal animosity. Warwick's break with Edward IV, motivated by disagreements over foreign policy, and the king's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, had transformed the most powerful noble in England from the primary architect of Yorkist success into a potential ally for Lancastrian restoration. The Earl's flight to France following his failed rebellion in 1470 created opportunities for diplomatic contact with Margaret that both parties approached with considerable scepticism and mutual distrust. Their initial negotiations, conducted through intermediaries who possessed the confidence of both parties, required careful exploration of terms that could reconcile their conflicting interests and previous hostilities. The personal meeting between Margaret and Warwick at Angers Cathedral in July 1470 represented a diplomatic triumph for Louis XIV, whose patient orchestration of this unlikely alliance demonstrated his skill at manipulating English factional conflicts for French advantage. The ceremony itself, conducted within the sacred precincts of the cathedral to emphasise the solemnity of the commitments being undertaken, required Margaret to perform the humiliating act of kneeling before the man she'd previously regarded as her family's greatest enemy. Warwick's reciprocal oath of loyalty to Henry VI and recognition of Prince Edward as heir apparent represented equally dramatic reversals of his previous political positions. The presence of French nobles as witnesses to these proceedings provided additional security for the agreement while emphasising the extent to which English political arrangements now depended on foreign intervention and support. The military preparations that followed the Angers Agreement revealed both the potential strengths and inherent weaknesses of the alliance between Margaret and Warwick, as their combined resources provided formidable capabilities, while their mutual suspicions created persistent coordination difficulties. Warwick's ability to recruit experienced soldiers from among English exiles in France, supplemented by French military advisors and equipment provided through Louis V's support, created a professional invasion force that possessed significant advantages over the feudal levies that had characterised previous Lancastrian military efforts. The Earl's naval resources, including ships provided by his supporters who controlled various English ports, offered possibilities for rapid movement across the Channel that could exploit opportunities created by domestic opposition to Edward IV's rule. The invasion of England, launched in September 1470, succeeded beyond the most optimistic expectations of its organisers, as Edward IV's government collapsed with remarkable speed when confronted by the combined threat of external invasion and internal rebellion. Warwick's landing at Dartmouth encountered minimal resistance, while his rapid advance toward London attracted substantial support from nobles and commons who had grown dissatisfied with Yorkist rule. The psychological impact of the Earl's return, enhanced by propaganda emphasising his role as the kingmaker, whose support had originally brought Edward to the throne, created momentum that overcame potential opposition before it could organise effective resistance. Edward IV's flight to Burgundy, accomplished with even greater haste than his predecessor's earlier escape to Scotland, eliminated the primary obstacle to Lancastrian restoration, while demonstrating the fragility of royal authority when confronted by determined opposition supported by adequate military resources. Henry VI's restoration to the throne on October 3, 1470, represented the culmination of nearly a decade of exile and struggle, though the circumstances of his return revealed both the artificial nature of his authority and the continuing limitations imposed by his mental condition. The former king's release from the Tower of London, accomplished by Warwick's supporters who found him in a state of apparent confusion about recent events, required careful management to create appropriate public impressions of royal dignity and competence. Henry's appearance at his restoration ceremony, dressed in robes that concealed the physical deterioration resulting from years of captivity and stress, impressed observers primarily through the contrast with his previous circumstances, rather than any demonstration of renewed vigour or capability. His brief public statements, carefully prepared by his handlers to avoid embarrassing displays of confusion or inappropriate remarks, emphasised themes of forgiveness and national reconciliation that reflected his genuine personal inclinations while serving the political needs of his restorers. Margaret's delayed return to England reflected both practical difficulties in organising her journey and strategic calculations about the optimal timing for her appearance on the political stage. Her continued residence in France during the early months of Henry's restoration allowed Warwick to consolidate his control over governmental machinery while avoiding immediate confrontation over the distribution of authority between the restored Queen and the Earl who had made restoration possible. The delicate negotiations conducted between Margaret's representatives and Warwick's agents regarding future governmental arrangements revealed the fundamental tensions inherent in an alliance based on temporary convergence of interests rather than genuine compatibility of long-term objectives. Both parties recognised that their cooperation would likely prove temporary, but the immediate benefits of successful restoration outweighed concerns about future conflicts over policy direction and personal authority. The administrative challenges facing the restored Lancastrian government reflected both the disruption created by a decade of civil warfare and the specific difficulties associated with reversing the personnel changes and policy initiatives implemented during Yorkist rule. Warwick's appointments to major governmental positions necessarily favoured individuals whose loyalty to the Lancastrian cause could be trusted, but many of these appointees lacked the administrative experience necessary for effective management of complex bureaucratic responsibilities. The financial situation inherited from Edward IV's government included both substantial debts accumulated through military expenditure and revenue streams that had been disrupted by the political upheaval accompanying the Restoration. The need to reward supporters who had risked their lives and fortunes for the Lancastrian cause created additional financial pressures that strained governmental resources beyond their capacity to meet competing demands. The military situation facing the restored government remained precarious despite the initial success of Warwick's invasion, as Edward IV's exile in Burgundy provided him with opportunities to organise counter-invasion efforts supported by his brother-in-law Charles the Bold. The Burgundian duke's hostility toward Louis the Fountain created natural incentives for supporting Edward's restoration efforts, while his substantial financial resources and military capabilities offered realistic possibilities for reversing the recent Lancastrian triumph. Warwick's efforts to strengthen English coastal defences and organise reliable military forces for resisting potential Yorkist invasion were complicated by the limited time available for such preparations, and the questionable loyalty of many nobles whose support for the Restoration remained conditional on its continued success. The Earl's recognition that his political survival depended entirely on preventing Edward's return created pressures for aggressive action that conflicted with the careful consolidation that the situation actually required. The brief period of Lancastrian restoration, lasting less than 6 months, would prove insufficient for addressing the fundamental challenges that had contributed to the dynasty's original downfall, while the circumstances of Henry's return had created new vulnerabilities that would ultimately prove fatal to his cause. The artificial nature of the political arrangements that had brought him back to the throne, dependent on foreign support and the temporary alliance between former enemies, provided an inherently unstable foundation for royal authority. Margaret's continued absence from England during these crucial months eliminated the most capable leader available to the Lancastrian cause at precisely the moment when decisive action might have secured permanent restoration. The stage was set for the final phase of the dynastic struggle that would determine not only Henry's personal fate, but the ultimate resolution of the civil conflicts that had torn England apart for over a decade. The brief restoration of Henry VI to the English throne in October 1470 represented perhaps the most pathetic spectacle of royal authority in medieval European history. When Warwick's men escorted the former king from his Tower prison to Westminster Palace, observers were struck by the dramatic deterioration in Henry's physical appearance and mental acuity after 5 years of captivity. His once gentle features had become gaunt and prematurely aged, while his famous piety had transformed into an almost catatonic withdrawal from worldly concerns that left him barely capable of recognising familiar faces or comprehending the political transformation that had restored him to nominal power. The ceremonial robes hastily prepared for his public appearances hung loosely on his diminished frame, creating a visual representation of the hollow nature of his restored authority. The so-called readeption of Henry VI functioned as an elaborate theatrical performance orchestrated entirely by the Earl of Warwick, who recognised that the former king's presence provided essential legitimacy for the new governmental arrangements, while his incapacity ensured that real power remained concentrated in more capable hands. Henry's daily routine during this period followed a carefully structured pattern designed to maintain public impressions of royal competence, while minimising opportunities for embarrassing displays of confusion or inappropriate behaviour. His morning audiences, limited to brief ceremonial encounters with carefully selected visitors, were managed by attendants who provided subtle guidance about appropriate responses to questions and situations that might otherwise have overwhelmed his limited cognitive abilities. The king's afternoon religious observances, conducted in private chapels where his mumbled prayers and vacant stares could not be observed by potential critics, provided the spiritual comfort that seemed to represent his only remaining connection to purposeful activity. Contemporary accounts of Henry's behaviour during council meetings reveal the extent to which his mental deterioration had progressed since his earlier periods of incapacity. Warwick's secretaries recorded instances where the king would sit motionless for entire sessions, apparently unaware of the discussions proceeding around him, occasionally nodding in a response to direct questions without any indication that he had understood their content. His rare attempts to participate in governmental business typically involved rambling monologues about religious topics that bore no relationship to the matters under consideration, requiring diplomatic intervention from his handlers to redirect attention to practical concerns. The contrast between Henry's current condition and the decisive leadership that the political situation demanded could not have been more stark, creating a governmental structure where royal authority existed purely as symbolic window dressing for decisions made entirely by others. Warwick's management of the restored monarchy revealed both his political sophistication and his recognition that the arrangement's artificial nature made it inherently unstable and vulnerable to challenge from more legitimate claimants. The Earl's appointments to major governmental positions necessarily favoured individuals whose personal loyalty to him outweighed their theoretical allegiance to the Lancastrian dynasty, creating an administrative structure that functioned more as Warwick's personal regime than as a genuine restoration of Henry's royal authority. His control over the Great Seal, exercised through compliant chancellors who implemented his decisions while maintaining the fiction of royal approval, allowed him to reverse many of Edward IV's policy initiatives while rewarding his supporters through grants of confiscated Yorkist properties. The speed and thoroughness of these personnel and policy changes demonstrated both the Earl's organisational capabilities and his understanding that time was limited for consolidating his political revolution. The financial challenges facing the restored government reflected both the immediate costs of rewarding supporters and the longer-term structural problems that had contributed to the Lancastrian dynasty's original difficulties. Warwick's promises of restoration for nobles who had lost lands and titles during Yorkist rule created obligations that exceeded the Crown's available resources, while his need to maintain military forces capable of resisting Edward IV's anticipated return required expenditures that strained the treasury beyond its capacity. The Earl's attempts to address these fiscal pressures through forced loans and extraordinary taxation generated resentment among populations already exhausted by decades of civil warfare and governmental instability. His correspondence with foreign allies, particularly Louis XI, revealed growing desperation for financial assistance that the French king proved reluctant to provide on the scale that the situation required. Margaret of Anjou's delayed return to England during the spring of 1471 reflected both practical difficulties in organising her journey and strategic miscalculations about the stability of the restored regime that would prove fatal to Lancastrian hopes. The Queen's extended negotiations with Louis XI regarding the terms of French military support consumed precious time that might have been used more effectively for direct involvement in English governmental consolidation. Her insistence on bringing substantial French military advisors and equipment while potentially valuable for future military operations, created diplomatic complications that delayed her departure while generating English suspicions about foreign domination of the restored monarchy. The irony that Margaret's absence during the crucial early months of Henry's restoration eliminated the most capable leader available to the Lancastrian cause would become apparent only after events had progressed beyond the possibility of recovery. Edward IV's counter-invasion, launched from his Burgundian exile in March 1471, succeeded with remarkable speed due to a combination of superior planning, adequate financial resources, and the fundamental weaknesses that characterised Warwick's governmental arrangements. The former King's Landing at Ravenspur with a small but professional force demonstrated both his personal courage and his realistic assessment that English political loyalties remained fluid enough to permit dramatic reversals of fortune through decisive action. His initial proclamation that he sought only restoration of his ducal inheritance, rather than immediate resumption of royal authority, provided political cover for nobles who might support his return while avoiding direct confrontation with the restored Lancastrian government. The psychological impact of Edward's presence on English soil, enhanced by his reputation for military competence and personal charisma, created momentum that overcame potential resistance before it could organise effective opposition. The speed with which Edward's small invasion force grew into a formidable army revealed both the artificial nature of support for Henry's restoration and the extent to which English political loyalties had become based on calculations of immediate advantage, rather than traditional dynastic allegiance. His brother George, Duke of Clarence, whose reconciliation with Edward eliminated a crucial pillar of Warwick's political coalition, brought substantial military resources along with his personal submission to royal authority. The defection of other nobles who had initially supported the restoration, motivated by recognition that Edward's return had created superior prospects for political advancement, demonstrated the pragmatic considerations that increasingly dominated English political behaviour. Within weeks of his landing, Edward commanded forces that significantly outnumbered the troops available to Warwick, while his control over key strategic positions provided tactical advantages that complemented his numerical superiority. The Battle of Barnet, fought in dense fog during the early morning hours of April 14th, 1471, represented the decisive military engagement that determined the ultimate failure of Henry's restoration and sealed Warwick's personal fate. The Earl's tactical dispositions, based on defensive positions that had proven successful in previous engagements, failed to account for the superior coordination and morale that characterised Edward's reunited forces. The thick fog that shrouded the battlefield created confusion that favoured the attacking Yorkist troops, whose recent victories had enhanced their confidence and cohesion, while hampering the defensive coordination that Warwick's strategy required. The battle's most significant casualty occurred when Warwick himself fell during the fighting, struck down while attempting to rally his disintegrating forces for a final stand against Edward's advancing infantry. Warwick's death at Barnet eliminated the primary architect of Henry's restoration, while demonstrating the personal nature of medieval political authority that made individual leadership crucial for maintaining complex governmental arrangements. The Earl's body, discovered among the Lancastrian dead after Edward's victory, bore multiple wounds that indicated he had fought with desperate courage after recognising that the battle was lost. His death represented more than simply the elimination of a powerful political figure. It marked the end of the artificial coalition that had made Henry's restoration possible, while removing the only individual capable of coordinating continued resistance to Yorkist rule. The psychological impact of Warwick's fall extended beyond immediate military considerations to encompass the broader recognition that the Lancastrian cause had lost its most competent leader at precisely the moment when decisive leadership was most essential. Margaret of Anjou's belated arrival in England on the very day of the Barnet disaster represented the culmination of strategic miscalculations that had characterised her approach to the Restoration crisis from its inception. Her landing at Weymouth with Prince Edward and a small force of French advisors and English exiles occurred just as news of Warwick's defeat and death was spreading throughout the kingdom, eliminating any possibility that her presence could salvage the military situation. The Queen's immediate recognition that the political landscape had been fundamentally altered by the Barnet outcome demonstrated her continued strategic acumen, though her options for effective action had been reduced to desperate expedients that offered minimal prospects for success. Her decision to march inland toward Wales, seeking to unite with Jasper Tudor's forces in regions where Lancastrian loyalty remained strongest, represented realistic assessment of her limited alternatives rather than confident strategic planning. The final Lancastrian army that assembled around Margaret's standard during her march through southwestern England represented a curious mixture of veteran exiles who had shared her years of exile, Welsh supporters whose loyalty to the Tudor connection remained intact, and local recruits whose motivations ranged from genuine dynastic allegiance to simple desire for military adventure. Prince Edward's presence with this force provided crucial symbolic leadership for the Lancastrian cause, as his youth and energy contrasted favourably with his father's obvious incapacity, while offering hope for future restoration even if immediate military efforts failed. Contemporary accounts describe the 17-year-old prince as possessing the martial temperament that his father had always lacked, displaying enthusiasm for military exercises and strategic discussions that impressed veteran commanders who had served under more capable Lancastrian leaders. Edward IV's pursuit of Margaret's army revealed both his recognition that complete elimination of Lancastrian resistance required decisive military action, and his understanding that the Queen's political capabilities made her continued freedom a persistent threat to Yorkist stability. The King's forced marches through the English countryside, covering remarkable distances in pursuit of his enemies, demonstrated both his personal stamina and his army's professional competence under demanding conditions. His strategic objective extended beyond simple military victory to encompass the capture or elimination of the entire Lancastrian leadership, including Margaret herself and Prince Edward, whose deaths would finally resolve the dynastic disputes that had torn England apart for over a decade. The relentless nature of Edward's pursuit reflected his understanding that half measures had previously allowed Lancastrian resistance to survive and regenerate despite repeated military defeats. The Battle of Tewkesbury, fought on May 4th, 1471, represented the final major military engagement of the Wars of the Roses, and witnessed the complete destruction of organised Lancastrian resistance through the systematic elimination of the dynasty's remaining leadership. Margaret's army, exhausted by their rapid march and demoralised by news of Warwick's death, occupied defensive positions that provided some natural advantages but could not overcome the superior numbers and enhanced morale that characterised Edward's pursuing forces. The battle itself proceeded with the grim efficiency that had come to characterise Edward IV's military operations, as his experienced commanders implemented tactical plans designed to maximise casualties among enemy leadership while minimising their own losses. The systematic nature of the Yorkist assault reflected both professional military competence and deliberate political calculation aimed at eliminating future sources of Lancastrian resistance. The death of Prince Edward during the battle eliminated the Lancastrian succession, while providing Edward IV with the ultimate resolution of the dynastic disputes that had motivated decades of civil warfare. Contemporary accounts of the prince's death vary significantly in their details, with some sources describing his fall during the actual fighting, while others suggest that he was captured and subsequently executed by Yorkist commanders who recognised the political necessity of eliminating Henry VI's heir. The 17-year-old prince's death, regardless of its precise circumstances, represented both personal tragedy for his parents and political triumph for the Yorkist cause, as it removed the primary justification for continued resistance to Edward's rule. The psychological impact of Prince Edward's elimination extended beyond immediate military considerations to encompass the broader recognition that the Lancastrian dynasty's future had been permanently extinguished through violent action that demonstrated the ultimate consequences of unsuccessful political opposition. Margaret of Anjou's capture following the battle represented the final humiliation of a queen who had demonstrated remarkable political capabilities throughout nearly 3 decades of marriage to an ineffective king. Her discovery hiding in a nearby religious house, where she had sought sanctuary after witnessing the destruction of her army and the death of her son, provided Edward IV with the ultimate symbol of Yorkist triumph over Lancastrian pretensions. The former queen's appearance when brought before her captor shocked contemporary observers, as her grief over Prince Edward's death had apparently aged her dramatically, while her obvious despair contrasted sharply with the confident political leader who had coordinated resistance efforts for over a decade. Her subsequent imprisonment, while conducted with appropriate respect for her royal status, effectively eliminated the last significant threat to Edward's political security, while providing tangible evidence that the civil wars had finally reached definitive resolution. Henry VI's mysterious death in the Tower of London on May 21, 1471, occurred under circumstances that generated immediate suspicion and would fuel historical controversy for centuries. The official announcement that the former king had died of melancholy, following news of his son's death and his wife's capture, provided a convenient explanation that avoided awkward questions about the specific causes of his demise. However, contemporary observers noted that Henry's death occurred with remarkable timing, just as Edward IV was consolidating his restored authority and eliminating potential sources of future opposition to his rule. The former king's body, when examined by witnesses, showed no obvious signs of violence, though medieval medical knowledge was insufficient to detect more subtle forms of assassination that might have been employed to eliminate a dangerous political prisoner. The circumstances surrounding Henry's final days in the Tower revealed both his continued mental deterioration and the practical challenges that his survival posed for Edward IV's governmental stability. His guards reported that the former king had become increasingly withdrawn following news of Tewkesbury, spending entire days in prayer while apparently unaware of his physical surroundings or personal needs. The contrast between Henry's current condition and his earlier periods of apparent recovery suggested that the trauma of losing his son and witnessing the final destruction of his cause had completed the psychological collapse that had been developing for decades. His death, whether from natural causes related to his mental condition or through more direct intervention, eliminated the symbolic focus around which future Lancastrian resistance might have organised while providing Edward with the security that comes from the permanent elimination of rival claimants. The immediate aftermath of Henry's death witnessed carefully orchestrated public ceremonies designed to demonstrate both respect for his person and the finality of Yorkist triumph over Lancastrian pretensions. His body was displayed at St. Paul's Cathedral, where thousands of Londoners viewed the remains of their former king, many noting the peaceful expression that suggested he had finally found the spiritual tranquility that had eluded him throughout his troubled reign. The funeral procession to Chertsey Abbey, conducted with appropriate royal honours despite the controversial circumstances of his death, provided public closure to the dynastic conflicts while emphasising Edward IV's magnanimity toward defeated enemies. Contemporary accounts describe genuine popular mourning for Henry's death, reflecting both sympathy for his personal sufferings and recognition that his gentle nature had made him an inappropriate victim of the violent political forces that had destroyed his reign. The posthumous veneration of Henry VI as a saint-like figure began almost immediately after his death and reflected popular recognition of the contrast between his personal piety and the brutal political realities that had destroyed his kingdom. Pilgrims began visiting his tomb at Chertsey Abbey within months of his burial, reporting miraculous healings and divine visions that they attributed to the former king's intercession. The development of this cult of sanctity, while never officially recognised by ecclesiastical authorities, demonstrated the extent to which popular memory had transformed Henry from failed monarch into martyred saint whose sufferings had been caused by the sins of his subjects rather than his own inadequacies. The political implications of this posthumous rehabilitation would influence English religious and cultural development for generations, as Henry's memory became associated with an idealised vision of Christian kingship that contrasted sharply with the more pragmatic approaches to royal authority that characterised his successors. The historical assessment of Henry VI's reign must acknowledge both his personal virtues and his complete inadequacy for the practical demands of medieval monarchy during a period of unprecedented challenge. His genuine piety, intellectual curiosity, and charitable nature represented admirable personal qualities that would have served him well in religious life, but proved entirely insufficient for managing the complex military, financial, and diplomatic crises that confronted English kings during the 15th century. The contrast between his educational patronage, which produced lasting institutions like Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, and his military failures, which lost an entire continental empire, illustrates the fundamental mismatch between his temperament and the requirements of his inherited position. His mental illness, while generating appropriate sympathy for his personal sufferings, created governmental instability that contributed directly to the civil wars that devastated England during the final decades of his reign. The ultimate tragedy of Henry VI lies not in his personal failures, which were largely beyond his control, but in the broader consequences of his inadequate kingship for the English people, who suffered through decades of civil warfare that might have been avoided under more effective royal leadership. His death in 1471 marked not only the end of his personal ordeal, but also the conclusion of the Lancastrian dynasty's claims to the English throne, bringing to a close a royal line that had governed England for over 60 years. The Wars of the Roses, which had originated partly from the power vacuum created by his incapacity, would finally end with his elimination, allowing England to begin the process of recovery and reconstruction under the more capable leadership of Edward IV and his successors. Henry VI's legacy would ultimately rest not on his political achievements, which were virtually non-existent, but on his educational foundations and his posthumous reputation as a royal martyr, whose sufferings had been caused by forces beyond his understanding or control.